The year is 1348, and the winter has settled over the valley with a heavy, quiet permanence. Outside the thick, impenetrable stone walls of the apothecary's keep, the snow falls in endless, rhythmic sheets. It is a deep, unbroken winter, the kind that blankets the world in a profound and utter silence. The sky is a flat, pale slate, completely devoid of the sun's harsh glare, offering only a soft, muted twilight that stretches on through the passing hours. There is no wind, only the steady, hypnotic downward drift of millions of fat, heavy snowflakes, each one settling upon the frozen earth with a microscopic whisper. They gather on the steep, slate roofs of the town. They pile up upon the cobblestone streets, burying the stones beneath a perfectly smooth, untouched layer of pristine white powder. The world outside is entirely asleep, frozen in a gentle, icy slumber, completely removed from the warmth and the safety of the room within. Inside the chamber, the atmosphere is heavy with the scent of dried earth, sweet wood smoke, and the faint, dusty fragrance of old parchment. The walls of the room are constructed from massive blocks of gray granite, each one carved by hand centuries ago, their surfaces smoothed by time and settled into an unmovable, protective embrace. The stones are nearly 3 feet thick, forming an absolute barrier against the freezing temperatures of the world beyond the glass. The air in the room is deeply warm, intensely still, and perfectly safe. There are no sudden noises here. There is no urgency. There is only the slow, methodical passage of time, marked by the steady crackle of the hearth and the gentle, rhythmic ticking of a brass water clock in the far corner of the study. The physician, wrapped tightly in a long, heavy robe of undyed wool, sits in a high-backed wooden chair positioned securely beside the roaring fire. The chair is crafted from dark, aged oak, the wood polished to a dull, rich sheen by years of quiet use. It creaks ever so slightly as the physician shifts their weight, a low, comforting sound that blends perfectly with the popping of the embers. The wool of the robe is incredibly thick, slightly coarse to the touch, but entirely impenetrable to the cold. It falls in heavy, weighted folds over the physician's lap, pooling upon the dark, uneven planks of the floorboards. The feet are covered in thick, hand-knitted stockings made from the finest, softest sheep's wool, resting comfortably on a small rug woven from the pelts of fallow deer. Every inch of the body is insulated, protected, and deeply warmed by the layers of fabric and the radiant heat of the hearth. In the massive stone fireplace, a large pile of seasoned birch logs burns with a slow, hypnotic intensity. The bark of the birch is papery and white, curling back in slow motion as the flames lick at its edges, transforming into a fragile, glowing ash before crumbling silently into the bed of embers below. The flames are entirely mesmerizing. They dance in slow, lazy arcs of deep orange, soft gold, and occasional flashes of pale blue where the heat is most concentrated. The fire produces a continuous, soothing soundscape, a low, roaring hum beneath a sequence of gentle snaps, subtle crackles, and the quiet hiss of a tiny pocket of sap boiling away in the core of the wood. The heat radiates outward in visible waves, warming the granite stones of the hearth until they are almost too hot to touch, and pushing back the winter chill until it is nothing more than a memory of a distant season. On a heavy, wrought-iron hook suspended over the fire, a cast-iron kettle hangs, perfectly blackened by years of use. Inside the kettle, water is brought to a slow, rolling boil. The sound of the water is a steady, rhythmic bubbling, a low and continuous murmur that adds another layer of profound comfort to the quiet room. Steam rises from the spout of the kettle in a thin, twisting ribbon of pure white vapor, carrying with it the faint, clean smell of pure well water. The physician slowly extends a hand, the sleeve of the heavy wool robe sliding back to reveal pale skin warmed by the firelight. With deliberate, unhurried movements, they grip the thick, leather-wrapped handle of the kettle, feeling the reassuring weight of the iron. Beside the chair rests a small, circular table made of sanded pine, its surface scarred and stained with the marks of countless crushed herbs and spilled tinctures. Upon this table sits a simple, sturdy cup made of fired clay, glazed in a dark, earthy brown. The physician carefully tilts the heavy kettle, and the boiling water pours out in a smooth, clear arc, splashing gently against the bottom of the clay cup. The sound is a hollow, satisfying trickle that gradually deepens in pitch as the cup fills to the brim. Into the steaming water, the physician sprinkles a small pinch of dried chamomile flowers and a few crushed leaves of winter mint. The dried herbs float upon the surface of the water for a brief moment before slowly becoming saturated, expanding and unfurling as they release their essential oils into the liquid. A sweet, deeply calming aroma rises from the cup, mixing with the wood smoke to create an atmosphere of pure, undisturbed tranquility. The physician wraps both hands around the warm clay cup, feeling the heat seep through the ceramic and into their palms. It is a grounding sensation, a simple physical reminder of safety and warmth. They lift the cup slowly, taking a long, deep breath of the fragrant steam, letting the warmth fill their lungs before taking a small, cautious sip. The tea is hot, earthy, and perfectly soothing. It washes down the throat, carrying a wave of internal warmth that matches the external heat of the fire. There is no rush to finish the tea. The cup is simply held, cradled gently in the lap, serving as a small, personal hearth held between the hands. When the tea is finished, the empty cup is set back upon the pine table with a soft, muted clink. The physician's daily tasks are entirely mundane, an endless repetition of careful, methodical preparations that require no thought, only steady, rhythmic action. It is time to inspect the heavy garments of the trade. From a sturdy wooden peg driven deep into the stone wall, the physician lifts the heavy, ankle-length overcoat. This is not ordinary clothing. It is a fortress of waxed canvas and thick, boiled leather, designed to create an absolute barrier between the wearer and the outside world. The coat is incredibly heavy, weighing down the arms as it is carried to the center of the room and laid out flat across a large oak worktable. The material is stiff from the ambient cold of the room's edges, the dark brown leather rigid and unyielding. The physician's task is to soften it, to waterproof it anew, and to ensure every seam is perfectly sealed. From a small shelf above the table, they retrieve a round tin filled with a mixture of natural beeswax and rendered animal fat. Prying the lid off the tin, a faint, sweet smell of honey and tallow fills the immediate air. The salve is firm, requiring the heat of the fingers to soften it. The physician digs 2 fingers into the wax, scooping out a small, pale yellow lump, and begins to work it into the surface of the heavy leather coat. The motion is entirely circular and unendingly repetitive. Round and round the fingers go, pressing the wax deep into the pores of the leather. The sound is a soft, continuous swishing noise, the friction of skin against treated hide. As the warmth of the hands melts the wax, the leather begins to darken, taking on a rich, lustrous shine. The stiff material slowly yields, becoming supple and flexible under the steady, monotonous pressure. The physician works systematically, starting at the broad shoulders of the coat and moving slowly down the length of the right sleeve, paying special attention to the heavy, waxed linen threads that bind the seams together. Every stitch must be coated, every inch of leather must be sealed. It is a process that takes hours, but there is nowhere else to be and nothing else to do. Time is measured only by the slow progression of the darkening leather and the steady depletion of the wax in the tin. Once the right sleeve is fully conditioned, the physician moves to the left, repeating the exact same motions. The room is so quiet that the sound of their own steady breathing forms a rhythmic background track to the soft rubbing of the wax. The fire pops occasionally, throwing a brief, warm shadow across the work table, but the light is mostly steady and golden. The heavy coat, designed for a terrible outside world, is here reduced to nothing more than a simple, physical object requiring mundane care. There is no fear of what the coat represents. There is only the texture of the leather, the smell of the beeswax, and the endless, soothing repetition of the conditioning process. After the coat is entirely treated, it is hung back upon its peg, heavy and gleaming in the firelight. The physician then turns their attention to the most iconic, yet practically tedious piece of their equipment, the long, beaked mask. The mask is constructed from stiffened, dark leather, riveted together with small, perfectly smooth brass studs. It sits upon the table like an empty, hollow shell. The physician picks it up, turning it slowly in their hands, examining the thick glass eyepieces set into the leather sockets. They take a small, soft cloth of heavily worn linen and begin to polish the glass. The cloth moves in slow, precise circles over the cold glass lenses. Squeak, rub, squeak, rub. The motion is incredibly hypnotic, erasing small smudges of dust until the glass is perfectly clear, reflecting the flames of the fire in tiny, twin infernos. The true work of the mask, however, lies in its hollow beak. It must be packed with fresh herbs and dried flowers, a filtration system of scents meant to overpower the odors of the world. The physician walks slowly to the far end of the room, where a massive wooden cabinet stands against the stone wall. The cabinet is filled with dozens of small, square drawers, each one labeled with a neat, faded script detailing the contents within. The wooden drawer pulls are smooth and worn from decades of use. The physician reaches out and pulls the first drawer. It slides open with a soft, wooden sliding sound, a gentle scraping of pine against pine. Inside, nestled in the darkness of the drawer, lies a bed of dried lavender. The physician gathers a small handful of the purple buds. They are dry, brittle, and rustle like falling autumn leaves as they are scooped up. The scent is immediately overwhelming but deeply relaxing, a powdery, floral aroma that instantly induces a sense of calm heaviness in the eyelids. The lavender is carried to a heavy marble mortar resting on the work table. The dried flowers are dropped into the smooth, curved bowl of the mortar with a soft, scattered scratching sound. Next, a drawer containing dried rose petals is opened. The petals are deep crimson, fading to black at the edges and smell of old, sweet earth. A handful of petals joins the lavender. Finally, a few whole cloves, sharp and spicy, are added to the mix. The physician takes up the heavy marble pestle. It is cold to the touch and possesses a satisfying, grounded weight. They press the rounded end of the pestle into the bowl of the mortar, crushing down onto the dried plant matter. The sound is a deep, gritty crunching. Crunch, grind, scrape. The pestle moves in a slow, agonizingly deliberate circle around the bowl, breaking the brittle leaves and petals into a coarse, fragrant powder. The friction releases the trapped oils of the plants, creating a heavy, intoxicating cloud of perfume that hangs lazily in the warm air of the room. The physical effort is minimal, but the motion is constant. Grind, grind, scrape. The sound is incredibly repetitive, an acoustic lullaby of grinding stone and crushing leaves. It goes on and on, minute after minute, until the herbs are reduced to a perfect, unified consistency. With extreme care, the physician scoops the newly ground mixture into a small, finely woven linen pouch. The fabric of the pouch is soft and slightly frayed at the edges. They pull the small cotton drawstring tight, sealing the fragrant powder inside. This pouch is then pressed firmly into the very tip of the leather beak of the mask, packing it tightly so that any air drawn through it must first pass through the thick barrier of lavender, rose, and clove. The mask is now complete, prepared for a journey outside that will not happen today, nor likely tomorrow. The storm outside shows no signs of stopping, and the physician has no desire to leave the absolute safety of the warm stone room. The tasks of the morning have slowly bled into the quiet hours of the afternoon, though the gray light outside the frosted window has not changed in its dull intensity. The physician returns to the heavy oak chair by the fire. The logs have burned down into a thick, glowing bed of red-hot coals, radiating a steady, intense heat that warms the entire room from the floorboards up. The physician sits, pulling the heavy wool robe tighter around their shoulders, tucking their hands into the deep pockets. The room is perfectly still. The only sounds remaining are the muffled, distant thump of heavy snow sliding off the steep slate roof, the slow, rhythmic ticking of the water clock, and the soft, steady breathing of a person completely at peace, safe and warm, with absolutely nothing left to do but watch the embers glow and listen to the endless silence of the winter snow. The afternoon stretches out in a long, unbroken expanse of quiet time, moving with a slowness that feels almost tangible within the thick stone walls of the apothecary's keep. The dull, slate-gray light filtering through the frosted window panes does not shift or change. It simply exists, a flat and monotonous illumination that casts long, soft shadows across the floorboards. The fire continues its steady, rhythmic burning, having settled into a deep, mature heat. The logs are entirely blackened now, cracked in deep, glowing grid patterns that resemble a miniature, smoldering city. The heat they produce is no longer the crackling, leaping warmth of new wood, but a heavy, radiating blanket of thermal comfort that fills every corner of the enclosed space. In the far corner of the room, standing upon a small, sturdy pedestal of dark walnut, rests the water clock. It is a magnificent, entirely practical piece of machinery, devoid of any decorative flourishes, built solely for the methodical measurement of passing hours. The clepsydra is constructed of heavy, polished brass, though the metal has long since lost its bright sheen, settling instead into a warm, muted patina of aged gold and brown. It consists of two primary basins. The upper basin is a large, wide cylinder, filled to the brim with clear, cold well water. At the very bottom center of this upper basin lies a tiny, perfectly drilled aperture, no wider than the tip of a sewing needle. The physician sits in the heavy oak chair, perfectly still, listening to the mechanics of the clock. It is a sound that defines the silence of the room, a steady, unyielding metronome that anchors the mind to the present moment. The water from the upper basin presses down, forcing a tiny amount of moisture through the microscopic hole. The water travels down a small, guiding lip of copper, gathering at the very tip. It begins as a mere glint of light, a tiny swelling of liquid. Slowly, with agonizing precision, the droplet grows. It feeds upon the water pressing down from above, expanding, stretching, becoming heavier and heavier. The surface tension holds it in place for a long, stretched-out moment, a heavy teardrop of pure water hanging suspended in the warm, wood smoke-scented air. Then it falls. The droplet detaches silently from the copper lip, plunging downward through empty space, a tiny, perfect sphere of water. It falls for a fraction of a second before striking the surface of the water collected in the lower, receiving basin. Plink. The sound is incredibly sharp, yet soft. It is a hollow, resonant, watery note that echoes ever so slightly against the curved brass walls of the cylinder. A tiny, perfect ripple expands outward from the point of impact, bouncing against the edges of the bowl and returning to the center. Then the process begins again. The moisture gathers, it swells, it hangs, it falls, plink. The physician watches the clock for a very long time. The sound is deeply hypnotic, a repetitive lullaby that requires absolutely no thought or engagement. There is no rush. The lower basin is etched on its interior with horizontal lines, marking the slow accumulation of the water. It takes an hour for the water to rise from one etched line to the next. The gap between the lines seems immense, a vast distance of time measured only by the endless, steady succession of falling drops. Plink. The sound weaves itself into the background drone of the hearth fire, creating a symphony of pure, undisturbed monotony. Eventually, with a slow, deliberate shifting of weight, the physician rises from the heavy oak chair. The thick, undyed wool of the long robe rustles softly as it drags across the uneven grain of the floorboards. The floor is made of massive planks of old-growth oak, secured with hand-forged iron nails that have been worn completely smooth and flat by centuries of foot traffic. The wood is dark, almost black in places, polished by time and the constant friction of leather soles and thick woolen stockings. The physician moves toward the hearth, the soft pads of their stockinged feet making barely a whisper against the wood. SHHH, SHHH, SHHH. Resting against the stone mantel is a simple broom, crafted from a bundle of dried birch twigs tightly bound together with thick hemp cord around a smooth ashwood handle. The physician takes the broom, feeling the smooth, worn wood of the handle against their palm. The wood is warm from its proximity to the fire. They begin to sweep the stone hearth, clearing away the fine gray ash that has drifted from the main bed of coals. The motion is slow, rhythmic, and incredibly gentle. Scrape, swoosh, scrape, swoosh. The birch twigs drag across the rough-hewn granite of the hearth. The sound is dry, brittle, and deeply satisfying. It is the sound of order, of maintaining a small, clean space within the chaotic, frozen world outside. The physician sweeps the fine ash into a neat, perfectly conical pile at the edge of the stone. The dust is incredibly light, like powdered silk. A few microscopic motes of ash catch the updraft of the fire, spiraling upward into the dark chimney, briefly illuminated by the red glow of the embers before disappearing into the blackness. Next to the broom rests a small, heavy dustpan forged from dark copper. The physician kneels, the joints of their knees popping softly in the quiet room. They brush the neat pile of ash into the copper pan with short, precise strokes of the birch twigs. Tick, tick, swoosh. The ash slides smoothly over the lip of the copper. Once the hearth stone is perfectly clean, the physician carefully tips the dustpan over the hottest part of the fire. The fine ash cascades down, settling over the glowing red coals like a soft, gray blanket. For a moment, the heat of the fire is muffled, before it burns through the new layer of dust, glowing even brighter. The physical movement, however slight, has stirred a faint sense of hunger. The physician stands, returning the broom to its resting place, and turns toward the heavy wooden door that leads to the small pantry built directly into the thickest part of the stone wall. The iron latch is cold to the touch. Pressing down on the thumb piece yields a heavy, metallic clack, followed by the deep, resonant groan of the iron hinges as the thick oak door is pulled open. Inside the pantry, the air is significantly cooler, holding a distinct, earthy scent. It smells heavily of dry root vegetables, the sharp, salty tang of preserved meats hanging from the ceiling beams, and the dusty, comforting aroma of dried grains. In the dim light, large burlap sacks sit slumped against the far wall like sleeping animals. The physician approaches the sack containing whole rolled oats. The top of the sack is gathered and tied tightly with a thick, rough piece of twine. With slow, careful fingers, the physician unknots the twine. The stiff rope protests slightly, rubbing against itself with a dry, squeaking sound. As the sack is opened, the smell of the raw oats rises, a dry, starchy, incredibly plain scent. Reaching into a small wooden bucket beside the sack, the physician retrieves a wooden scoop. They plunge the scoop deep into the sack of oats. The sound is a loud, dry, cascading rush. SHHHK, CRRRSSSH. The thousands of tiny, hard grains rub against one another and against the smooth wood of the scoop. It is a dense, heavy sound, like walking through deep, dry leaves. The scoop emerges, piled high with the pale, flat oaten flakes. The physician carries the scoop to the large work table in the center of the room, where a small, deep iron pot sits waiting. They tilt the scoop, and the oats pour into the iron pot with a hollow, rattling clatter that slowly softens as the bottom of the pot is covered. Rattle, rattle, SHHH. The sound is incredibly tactile, evoking the rough, dry texture of the grains. Next, water must be added. On the table sits a large pitcher made of heavy, unglazed terracotta. The pitcher is filled with fresh water drawn from the deep well beneath the keep earlier that week. The physician grips the thick handle of the pitcher and pours. The water hits the dry oats with a heavy, soaking sound. The surface of the water instantly becomes cloudy as it mixes with the starch of the grain. A few stray oat flakes float to the surface, spinning lazily. The physician uses a long-handled wooden spoon, its bowl worn flat on one side from years of stirring, to gently mix the water and the oats. Slosh, scrape, slosh, scrape. The wooden spoon grinds softly against the rough cast-iron bottom of the pot. The pot is carried back to the hearth. Attached to the massive stone wall inside the fireplace is a pivoting iron arm, a trammel equipped with a series of heavy chain links and a hook. The physician swings the cold iron arm outward, its joint screaming softly with a high-pitched metallic squeal. The handle of the iron pot is looped over the hook, and the arm is swung back, positioning the pot directly over a bed of moderate, steady coals, away from the fierce heat of the main logs. Now begins the waiting and the stirring. The physician pulls up a smaller, three-legged wooden stool directly in front of the fire. They sit, extending their heavy, wool-covered legs toward the warmth. The wooden spoon is gripped lightly in the right hand. The fire begins to heat the iron pot. At first, nothing happens. The water simply rests there, cold and still. The physician stirs it anyway, a slow, continuous figure-8 motion. Scrape, slosh, drag. The sound is completely monotonous. Minutes pass. The water clock in the corner continues its endless dripping. Plink, plink, plink. Slowly, the water in the pot begins to heat. Thin wisps of white steam begin to curl upward from the surface, catching the orange glow of the embers. The smell of the oats begins to change, shifting from a dry, dusty scent to a warm, toasted, and deeply comforting aroma. The water begins to bubble, but not with a rapid, chaotic boil. The thick mixture of oats and water creates a heavy, viscous liquid. A bubble forms at the bottom of the pot, rising slowly through the thick porridge. It reaches the surface, expanding into a smooth, pale dome before bursting with a thick, wet blop sound. Blop. The physician stirs. Scrape, drag. Another bubble rises. Blop. The porridge thickens, becoming heavier and heavier against the wooden spoon. The effort required to stir increases slightly, a gentle, muscular tension in the forearm. The physician leans forward, entirely absorbed in the mundane task of ensuring the porridge does not stick to the bottom of the iron pot. The heat from the fire warms the front of the heavy wool robe, contrasting perfectly with the cool air pressing against the physician's back from the rest of the room. The world is reduced entirely to the circular motion of the spoon, the heavy, wet sounds of the boiling oats, and the warm, starchy steam rising into the air. When the porridge is thick, dense, and perfectly smooth, the physician swings the iron arm away from the heat. The bubbling immediately slows, stopping completely within a few seconds. Using a thick square of folded felt to protect their hand, the physician lifts the heavy pot from the hook and carries it back to the work table. A deep bowl, carved from a single piece of olive wood, sits ready. The porridge is poured from the pot into the wooden bowl. It is so thick that it does not flow. It slides in a heavy, steaming mass, landing in the bowl with a dull, wet thud. The physician sits at the table, taking up a heavy, dull pewter spoon. The meal is entirely silent. The porridge is hot, bland, and incredibly filling. It coats the mouth with a thick, comforting warmth, demanding heavy, slow chewing. There are no complex flavors to analyze, no spices to excite the palate. It is merely fuel, heavy and deeply grounding. Each spoonful is exactly the same as the last. The warmth of the food spreads downward into the stomach, creating a profound sense of internal heaviness and lethargy. The jaw works slowly, methodically. Swallow, breathe, scoop, eat. After the bowl is scraped completely clean, the dull scraping of the pewter spoon against the olive wood echoing softly, the physician pushes the bowl away. A deep, heavy sigh escapes their lips, a sound of absolute contentment and profound boredom. The tasks of the day are few, and the time remaining is vast. The physician stands and walks slowly to the single window of the chamber. The walls here are over 3 feet deep, meaning the window is set far back within a deep stone alcove. The glass is thick, uneven, and slightly green in color. It is not a single pane, but dozens of small, diamond-shaped pieces of glass held together by a lattice of dark, heavy lead. The outside temperature is so aggressively cold that a thick layer of frost has formed on the inside of the glass. The physician leans in closely, studying the ice. The frost is intricate and breathtakingly complex, yet entirely still. It looks like a dense forest of tiny, crystalline ferns overlapping and crisscrossing in endless fractal patterns. Near the bottom edges of the lead framing where the glass is coldest, the ice is thick, opaque, and white. As it creeps upward toward the center of the panes, it becomes delicate, translucent, and feathery. The physician raises a single finger, tracing the outline of a particularly large frost crystal. The glass is shockingly cold, a freezing, localized barrier against the terrible winter outside. The heat of the fingertip instantly melts a tiny path through the frost, leaving a streak of clear glass and a single drop of condensation that slowly rolls downward, carving a miniature river through the ice. Through the tiny, cleared streak of glass, the physician can see the outside world. The snow continues to fall. It has not slowed, nor has it hastened. It is exactly the same as it was hours ago, a wall of endless, falling white, silent, and utterly indifferent. The physician pulls their finger away, wiping the cold moisture onto the heavy wool of their robe. The tiny streak of clear glass immediately begins to cloud over again, the microscopic water droplets freezing back into a new layer of frost, sealing the room away once more, safe, warm, and perfectly, endlessly quiet. The flat, slate-gray light of the mid-afternoon has begun its slow, imperceptible surrender to the approaching evening. Through the thick, frost-choked panes of the deeply recessed window, the world outside is losing even its muted brightness, transitioning from a pale, snowy white into a deep, bruised shade of indigo. The winter night comes early in this valley, creeping over the steep, slate roofs and settling into the narrow cobblestone streets with a heavy, suffocating blanket of darkness. Inside the apothecary's keep, however, the encroaching night only serves to amplify the profound sense of safety and isolation. As the cold presses harder against the exterior of the massive granite walls, the contrast makes the air inside feel even thicker, even warmer, and even more deeply protective. The physician steps away from the frozen glass of the window, leaving the tiny, melted streak to freeze over once more. The heavy wool of the undyed robe swishes softly around their ankles with each slow, deliberate step back toward the center of the room. Upon the large oak worktable rests the empty olive wood bowl and the dull pewter spoon, the remnants of the simple, starchy meal of oats. Leaving these items uncleaned is not an option. The routine of the room demands perfect, methodical order. Every object must be returned to its proper state of readiness, not out of any sense of urgency, but simply because the maintenance of the room is the only task that exists to fill the vast, empty hours of the winter quarantine. Next to the work table sits a small, shallow basin carved from a single, heavy block of soapstone. The stone is a soft, mottled gray, smooth to the touch and incredibly dense. The physician lifts the large terracotta pitcher, which still holds a generous amount of the fresh well water used earlier to make the porridge. Tilting the heavy pitcher, a steady, clear stream of water is poured into the soapstone basin. The sound is a hollow, resonant drumming that shifts in pitch as the water level slowly rises against the smooth stone sides. Gurgle, splash, thrum. The water is icy cold, retaining the deep, earthen chill of the underground well from which it was drawn. It fills the basin exactly halfway, the surface becoming perfectly still, reflecting the warm, orange light of the distant hearth like a dark, liquid mirror. From a wooden peg on the side of the table, the physician retrieves a small, folded square of rough-spun linen. The cloth is stiff and completely dry, possessing the faint, clean scent of lye soap and fresh air from the summer months when it was last washed and hung in the sun. They drop the linen cloth into the cold water of the basin. It does not sink immediately. It rests upon the surface tension for a long, quiet moment, the coarse fibers slowly soaking up the moisture, turning from a pale, dusty gray to a deep, wet slate. The physician presses their fingertips against the cloth, pushing it down until it is entirely submerged. The icy water bites mildly at the skin, a brief, sharp contrast to the overwhelming warmth of the room, a sensation that is not unpleasant, merely grounding. Taking the heavy olive wood bowl, the physician submerges it into the soapstone basin. The bowl displaces the water with a soft, heavy thwump, a few droplets splashing gently over the edge onto the dark oak of the table. Using the sodden linen cloth, the physician begins to wipe the inside of the bowl. The motion is incredibly slow, entirely circular and perfectly repetitive. Squeak, rub, swish. The wet linen drags against the smooth, oiled surface of the olive wood, catching the tiny, starchy remnants of the porridge and lifting them away. The grain of the olive wood is complex and beautiful beneath the water, swirling patterns of light honey and dark brown that seem to shift and move as the wet cloth glides over them. The sound of the washing is a wet, continuous sloshing, a rhythmic, aqueous lullaby that fills the quiet space between the crackling of the fire and the ticking of the water clock. Round and round the cloth goes, pressing firmly against the bottom of the bowl, tracing the shallow curve of the sides and finally sweeping over the thick, rounded lip. The physician turns the bowl over in their hands, the water cascading off the polished wood in a smooth, glassy sheet, splashing softly back into the basin. They repeat the circular scrubbing on the outside of the bowl, ensuring every inch is perfectly clean. Next, the dull pewter spoon is lowered into the water. The metal is cold and heavy. The wet cloth is wrapped tightly around the bowl of the spoon, and the thumb applies slow, firm pressure, rubbing the metal back and forth. Squeak, squeal, slosh. The sound of the wet linen against the pewter is slightly higher in pitch, a soft, metallic friction that joins the heavy, watery sounds of the basin. When the washing is complete, the physician lifts the bowl and the spoon from the water. They are placed onto a dry, thick woolen mat resting on the far end of the table. From another peg, a completely dry, incredibly soft cloth of fine cotton is taken. The physician begins to dry the wooden bowl. This process is even slower than the washing. The cotton cloth is pressed deep into the wood, absorbing every single bead of moisture. The friction of the dry cloth against the clean wood produces a soft, hushing sound. SHHH, SHHH, SHHH. As the moisture is pulled away, the natural oils of the olive wood begin to gleam in the firelight, returning to their rich, warm luster. The spoon is dried with equal care, the soft cotton polishing the dull pewter until it reflects a distorted, silvery image of the room. The bowl and spoon are then carried to a small, open shelf on the wall and placed gently side by side. The task is finished. It has taken nearly half an hour, and it was entirely satisfying. With the washing done, the shadows in the room have deepened considerably. The indigo light from the window has vanished entirely, replaced by the absolute impenetrable black of a winter night. The only illumination now comes from the hearth, which casts long, flickering shadows across the ceiling beams. It is time to bring additional light to the study. The physician walks toward the heavy wooden cabinet, their stockinged feet padding softly across the floorboards. Pad, pad, pad. On a small shelf attached to the side of the cabinet sits a heavy, circular brass candle holder with a wide, deep saucer to catch any falling wax. In the center of the holder rests a fresh, unlit candle. This is not a common tallow candle, which would smoke and smell of animal fat, but a precious pillar of pure, refined beeswax. It is a thick, substantial cylinder, a pale, creamy yellow in color, and possesses a subtle, natural fragrance of summer honey and dried wildflowers. The physician picks up the heavy brass holder, feeling the cold metal against their palm, and carries it to the large work table, setting it down with a solid, metallic clunk. Beside the candle holder sits a small, rectangular wooden box made of polished cedar. The physician lifts the tiny brass latch of the box with their thumb. It opens with a dry, wooden click, revealing its contents: a curved piece of high-carbon steel, a sharp shard of dark gray flint, and a small pile of charred linen cloth, kept perfectly dry for catching sparks. The physician's movements are deliberate and practiced. They pinch a small square of the charred linen between their left thumb and the sharp edge of the flint stone. In their right hand, they grip the curved steel striker. They hold their hands close to the thick wick of the beeswax candle. With a swift, downward motion, they strike the steel against the sharp edge of the flint. Clack. The sound is sharp and brittle, ringing out clearly in the quiet room. A tiny shower of bright orange sparks flies outward, but none catch the linen. The physician waits a breath, resets their grip, and strikes again. Clack. Another shower of sparks. This time, one microscopic, glowing ember lands squarely on the fuzzy, blackened edge of the charred linen. Instantly, the ember takes hold. The physician lowers the flint and steel onto the table and lifts the piece of linen with both hands. They bring it close to their face, their eyes reflecting the tiny, glowing point of light. They begin to blow softly, a steady, gentle stream of warm air from their lips. Ha-ha-ha. With each breath, the tiny red ember spreads, crawling across the blackened linen, consuming it in a slow, flameless burn. The smell of wood smoke in the room is briefly joined by the sharp, slightly acrid scent of the smoldering cloth. When the ember is broad and glowing fiercely red, the physician lowers it to the wick of the beeswax candle. The wick is made of twisted hemp cord, previously dipped in melted wax. The physician presses the glowing ember directly against the tip of the wick and blows one final, sharp breath. A tiny wisp of white smoke curls upward from the hemp, followed immediately by a sudden, microscopic pop. And then, a tiny, fragile teardrop of pure golden flame blooms into existence. The physician carefully pinches out the remaining ember on the charred linen, returning the scrap to the cedar box and closing the lid. The new flame on the candle begins to grow, stabilizing as it melts the surrounding wax and draws the liquid fuel up through the wick. It burns with a steady, brilliant golden light, completely silent and perfectly still in the draft-free room. The warm light pushes back the encroaching shadows of the evening, illuminating the rough texture of the stone walls and casting a soft, yellow glow across the dark grain of the oak worktable. The scent of the melting beeswax slowly begins to fill the immediate air, a rich, sweet perfume that mingles perfectly with the heavier, deeper smell of the burning birch logs in the hearth. The room is now partitioned into two distinct spheres of warmth and light: the deep, red, roaring heat of the fireplace, and the small, gentle, golden halo of the candle. The physician pulls the heavy oak chair closer to the table, positioning it within the ring of the candlelight, and sits down. The thick wool robe pools around the chair legs, a heavy barrier against the colder air that pools near the floor. It is time for the evening records, a task of immense repetition and minimal thought. They reach toward the far edge of the table and pull forward a massive, heavy ledger. The book is bound in thick, dark brown leather, stretched tightly over wooden boards. The corners are protected by heavy brass caps, and the pages are held closed by a thick, leather strap with a heavy brass buckle. The physician unfastens the buckle. The thick leather strap slides free with a soft, leathery squeal. They open the heavy cover, laying it flat against the table. The sound of the book opening is a deep, structural creak of tight binding and thick paper. Inside, the pages are made of heavy, cream-colored vellum, thick and slightly stiff, smelling intensely of old dust, dried animal skin, and iron gall ink. The pages are densely packed with lines of neat, spidery handwriting detailing months of mundane inventory. Weights of flour, counts of dried roots, ounces of lavender, numbers of fresh candles. Beside the ledger sits a small, square bottle of dark glass, capped with a tightly fitting cork. Next to the bottle rests a bundle of long, white goose feathers. The physician selects a feather, feeling the smooth, rigid spine of the quill and the incredibly soft, downy barbs along the edges. From the pocket of their robe, they extract a small, folding knife with a handle of carved bone. Opening the blade, which is meticulously sharpened, they begin to trim the quill. Snip, slice, scrape. The tiny blade carves away the tip of the feather's shaft, creating a sharp, angled point. They make a tiny slit directly down the center of the tip to hold the liquid. The sound of the knife against the hollow quill is sharp and dry, a microscopic carving that requires steady hands and a quiet mind. Satisfied with the point, the physician closes the knife and returns it to their pocket. They uncork the ink bottle with a soft thwomp. The smell of the iron gall ink is sharp, astringent, and slightly metallic. They dip the freshly cut tip of the quill into the dark liquid, tapping it once against the glass rim to remove the excess. Then, they lower the quill to the heavy vellum page. Writing begins. The physician holds the quill loosely, letting the weight of their hand guide the tip across the paper. The sound is utterly transfixing. Scratch, scritch, scratch. The sharp point of the quill drags against the slightly rough, porous surface of the vellum. It is a slow, methodical sound, dipping and rising with the loops and lines of the letters. They write the date. They write a single sentence noting the steady, unchanging weather. They log the exact amount of oats consumed for the meal. Scritch, scratch, pause. They dip the quill again. Tap. Scratch, scritch, scratch. The physician writes with incredible slowness, focusing entirely on the perfect formation of each letter, ensuring the ink flows evenly and clearly. There is no rush to finish the page. The act of writing itself is the purpose, a physical manifestation of order and routine within the endless, silent winter. The candlelight flickers slightly, causing the shadow of the physician's hand to dance a slow, lazy waltz across the thick, yellowed pages of the ledger. The scratching of the quill continues, a tiny, rhythmic percussion that blends seamlessly into the low hum of the fire and the distant, dripping rhythm of the water clock, crafting a perfect symphony of profound and heavy stillness. The final entry in the heavy leather ledger is nearing its completion. The physician's hand moves with an agonizing, deliberate slowness, guiding the sharp tip of the goose feather quill across the thick, cream-colored surface of the vellum. The sound is a constant, rhythmic scratching, a tiny percussion instrument playing a solitary tune in the vast quiet of the stone chamber. Scritch, scratch, swish. The iron gall ink flows from the split tip of the quill in a dark, wet line, oxidizing almost immediately upon contact with the air, shifting from a deep, purplish black to a permanent, rusted iron hue. The physician does not rush the final letters. Each curve of the script is rounded with absolute care. Each vertical stroke is pulled downward with steady, even pressure. The beeswax candle, sitting securely in its heavy brass holder, casts a warm, golden halo over the page, causing the freshly laid ink to glisten like microscopic rivers of dark glass. With a final, elegant loop, the last word is finished. The physician gently lifts the quill from the vellum, the tiny scratching sound ceasing instantly, leaving a brief echoing silence in its wake. The quill is set aside, placed precisely upon a small, rectangular rest carved from dark ebony wood. Now the wet ink must be dried. Leaving the heavy book open to air dry is a risk. A stray draft, however unlikely in this sealed stone fortress, could smear the meticulous records. The physician reaches out toward a small, cylindrical object resting near the inkwell. It is a pounce pot, turned on a lathe from a single piece of pale ash wood, its surface worn perfectly smooth by decades of handling. The top of the pot is slightly concave and pierced with a geometric pattern of tiny, meticulously drilled holes. Inside the pounce pot rests fine, bone-dry river sand, gathered during the height of the summer and baked in an oven until every trace of moisture has been banished. The physician grips the smooth wooden cylinder, lifting it gently. They position the pot directly over the freshly written lines of the ledger. With a slow, subtle flick of the wrist, they shake the pot. Shhhhshhh. A fine, pale dust of sand cascades downward, falling through the golden candlelight like a miniature, localized snowstorm. The tiny grains strike the heavy vellum with a soft, collective whisper. Shhhhshhh. The sand settles over the wet ink, adhering instantly to the moisture. The physician repeats the motion, ensuring every freshly written word is completely buried beneath the pale, dry grains. The sound is incredibly soothing, a dry, hushed rattle that perfectly complements the crackle of the hearth fire. Once the ink is covered, the physician sets the pounce pot back upon the oak table with a muted wooden click. Now, there is nothing to do but wait. The room descends into a profound, heavy stillness. The physician sits perfectly motionless in the high-backed chair, watching the candlelight play across the tiny dunes of river sand on the page. The water clock in the corner continues its endless, rhythmic dripping. Plink, plink, plink. The minutes stretch out, long and elastic. The sand slowly draws the moisture from the iron gall ink, locking the words permanently into the fibers of the vellum. After a long, quiet interval, the drying process is complete. The physician reaches for a small, shallow dish made of polished horn, shaped like a crescent moon. They carefully lift the massive ledger with both hands, the heavy wooden boards creaking softly under the strain. Tilting the book toward the horn dish, they gently tap the spine of the ledger against the table. Thump, tap, tap. The dry sand, having done its duty, slides off the smooth vellum in a continuous, pale sheet. It pours into the horn dish with a dry, rushing sound, like the rustling of dead leaves in a gentle breeze. Sssssshh. The sand pools in the dish, leaving behind perfectly dry, crisply defined black letters upon the page. The physician blows a single, soft breath across the vellum to dislodge any remaining grains. Ha! The task of recording is done. The physician closes the heavy cover of the ledger. The thick vellum pages compress together with a deep, muffled thwomp. The heavy leather strap is pulled tight across the opening, the stiff material squeaking softly in protest, and the thick brass pin is pushed through the appropriate hole in the strap with a solid metallic clack. The book is secure, a sealed vault of mundane information, ready to be stored away. The physician pushes the heavy ledger toward the back of the work table, clearing the space directly in front of them. The cold of the deep winter night is pressing harder against the exterior of the keep. While the room remains deeply warm, the physician can feel a subtle shift in the air currents, a tiny whisper of chill radiating from the distant, frost-covered window. The fire in the hearth requires attention. It has burned down from a roaring blaze into a deep, intensely hot valley of glowing red and orange embers. It is a mature fire, radiating a heavy, baking heat, but it needs fresh fuel to sustain the temperature through the long, dark hours ahead. The physician rises slowly from the oak chair, the heavy wool of their robe dragging across the floorboards. Shhhh, shhhh, shhhh. They walk toward a deep, arched alcove built directly into the stone wall beside the fireplace. This alcove is stacked floor to ceiling with seasoned firewood, a massive reserve of fuel that smells of dry bark, old sap, and earth. The physician stands before the woodpile, studying the available logs. The selection of wood is a deliberate, thoughtful process. They bypass the quick-burning birch and the popping pine, seeking something denser, something that will burn slow and hot. Their hands, pale and illuminated by the red glow of the embers, reach out and grasp a massive, split log of aged oak. The bark is thick, deeply fissured, and rough against the skin. The log is incredibly heavy, possessing a dense, solid core of unyielding timber. The physician lifts it with both hands, feeling the strain in their forearms, a comforting physical exertion. They carry the heavy piece of oak back to the hearth. Resting against the stone mantel is a pair of massive wrought iron tongs, forged by a blacksmith decades ago. The iron is black, heavy, and cold to the touch. The physician grips the handles, squeezing them together. The pivot joint groans with a deep, metallic scrape. Using the heavy tongs, the physician reaches into the bed of glowing embers. They gently push the remaining, half-burned logs toward the back of the hearth, creating a level bed of intense, red-hot coals in the center. The sound of the coals shifting is a brittle, glass-like clinking, followed by a sudden, soft roar as the movement exposes the superheated core of the fire to fresh oxygen. A wave of intense, baking heat washes over the physician's face, a powerful, radiant wall of warmth that forces them to squint their eyes. With extreme care, they use the tongs to lift the new, heavy oak log, placing it perfectly atop the bed of red coals. The immediate reaction is a sharp, aggressive hiss as the microscopic traces of moisture remaining in the seasoned wood are instantly boiled away. HSSSSSSS. A thick ribbon of white smoke curls out from beneath the log, spiraling upward into the dark, soot-stained chimney. For a long moment, the log simply sits there, absorbing the immense heat from below. The edges of the rough bark begin to char, turning from a dusty gray to a deep, absolute black. The physician stands perfectly still, watching the physics of the fire take hold. Slowly, a tiny tongue of blue flame licks around the edge of the log. It vanishes, then returns, stronger this time, shifting from blue to a bright, pale yellow. The flame catches the rough edges of the wood, spreading outward in a slow, creeping line of fire. Crackle, pop. The fresh wood begins to burn, settling in for a slow, hours-long consumption. Satisfied with the hearth, the physician returns the heavy iron tongs to their resting place against the stone mantel. The physical movement and the intense heat of the fire have induced a deep, comfortable lethargy. However, the night is still young, and the mind requires one final, simple task to fully transition into the state of profound rest. The physician walks slowly toward the massive, multi-drawered cabinet that spans the far wall. The golden light of the beeswax candle on the table barely reaches this corner of the room, leaving the cabinet shrouded in heavy, warm shadows. The physician's hand reaches out, tracing the familiar, worn wooden pulls of the drawers in the near darkness. They locate a specific drawer in the third row, midway across. They pull it open, scrape, slide. The sound of the wooden runners is smooth and dry. Inside this drawer lie several small, tightly woven linen bags tied securely at the top with hemp twine. The physician lifts one of the bags. It is heavy, filled with small, hard objects that clatter together with a muted, glassy sound as the bag is moved. They carry the bag back to the center of the warm, candle-lit room. Upon the table sits a large, flat tray carved from a single piece of dark walnut, its edges raised slightly to prevent items from rolling away. The physician unties the hemp twine of the linen bag, the stiff rope yielding with a soft squeak. They hold the open bag over the wooden tray and slowly tip it forward. A cascade of dried resin tears pours out onto the dark wood. The sound is an incredible, complex clattering. Clack, clatter, tap, tick. Hundreds of small, hard pieces of hardened tree sap strike the wooden tray and bounce against one another. They are pieces of pure frankincense and dried pine rosin, gathered from distant, arid lands and deep, silent forests. The physician sets the empty linen bag aside and sits back down in the heavy oak chair. They pull the walnut tray closer. The resin tears are beautiful in the candlelight. They range in color from pale, milky yellow to a deep, translucent amber, resembling pieces of shattered raw gemstone. The scent rising from the tray is immediate and intoxicating. A sharp, clean, profoundly ancient smell of pine needles, dusty earth, and sweet, crystallized wood sap. It is a heavy, grounding aroma that clears the mind and settles the breathing. The task is simply to sort the resin. It is a completely unnecessary logistical exercise, performed solely for the tactile and auditory pleasure it provides. The physician extends their pale hands over the tray. With the tips of their index fingers, they begin to slide the pieces of resin across the smooth walnut wood. Scrape, tap, clink. They separate the larger, amber-colored tears from the smaller, milky pieces. The physical sensation of the resin is fascinating. The pieces are hard like stone, yet possess a microscopic, tacky residue that creates a tiny, almost imperceptible friction against the skin. The physician slowly pushes a pile of the larger frankincense tears to the left side of the tray. Swoosh, clatter. They isolate a particularly large, perfectly tear-shaped piece of deep golden rosin. They pick it up, holding it between their thumb and forefinger, bringing it close to the flame of the beeswax candle. The light shines directly through the crystallized sap, revealing tiny, suspended bubbles of ancient air trapped within the hard, golden matrix. It glows like a miniature sun held between the fingers. The physician stares at it for a long, silent minute, mesmerized by the clarity and the color, before gently placing it back onto the tray with a soft click. The sorting continues for an indefinite period. Time has completely lost its meaning, measured only by the slow, steady depletion of the unsorted pile in the center of the tray and the gradual accumulation of neat, separate mounds on the edges. The sound of the resin pieces sliding against the wood, the sharp clink as they strike one another, and the deep, aromatic smell of the ancient sap create an atmosphere of absolute, hypnotic monotony. The fire crackles its low, heavy song. The water clock drips its endless, watery rhythm. The candle burns with a silent, golden intensity. The heavy stone walls of the keep stand firm against the raging, silent winter outside, enclosing the physician in a perfect, impenetrable sphere of warmth, safety, and profoundly boring, deeply cozy isolation. The eyelids grow heavy, weighed down by the warmth and the endless repetition, yet the hands continue their slow, gentle sorting, a mindless, comforting dance across the dark wood of the tray. The massive log of aged oak, placed upon the glowing bed of embers in the previous hour, has now fully succumbed to the intense, radiating heat of the hearth. It no longer merely smolders. It has become the very heart of the fire. The thick, deeply fissured bark has burned away entirely, leaving behind a solid, block-like core of pure, glowing wood. The flames that dance across its surface are no longer the frantic, leaping yellow tongues of a new fire, but slow, undulating waves of deep orange and pale, translucent blue. They cling to the curves of the wood, consuming it with a steady, hushed roar that fills the room with an unbroken, oceanic sound. The heat radiating from this central mass is profound. It pushes outward in invisible, heavy waves, baking the air and warming the thick stone of the floorboards. To sit near it is to be wrapped in a thick, weighted blanket of pure thermal energy, a sensation that sinks deep into the muscles and joints, coaxing them into a state of absolute, unresisting relaxation. The physician remains seated in the heavy oak chair, the warmth seeping through the thick, undyed wool of their robe. The tray of sorted resin, a meticulous geography of golden and milky tears, rests quietly upon the table. The sorting is complete, but the work with the ancient sap is not yet finished. The larger, pure tears of frankincense and pine rosin are destined for the censer, but the smaller, fractured pieces, the dust and the shards, must be reduced entirely to powder to be used in thick medicinal salves. The physician reaches out and gently slides the walnut tray to the side, creating a clear workspace directly beneath the warm, unwavering halo of the beeswax candle. From a lower shelf on the heavy wooden cabinet, the physician retrieves a different set of tools. The marble mortar used earlier for the dried flowers is too porous, too easily stained by the sticky, clinging nature of raw tree resin. Instead, they bring forth a mortar and pestle cast from solid, heavy brass. The metal is thick and unpolished, possessing a dull, muted, greenish-gold hue that speaks of decades of continuous use. The physician sets the brass bowl onto the oak table. It lands with a deep, resonant metallic thud, a sound possessing immense weight and solidity. The pestle, equally heavy and shaped like a blunt, elongated bell, is placed softly beside it with a dull clink. With slow, precise movements, the physician gathers the small pile of rejected resin shards from the walnut tray. They use a small, flat scraper made of polished horn to sweep the tiny fragments together. Scrape, shhh, clatter. The horn glides smoothly over the wood. The gathered shards are scooped up and tipped into the deep bowl of the brass mortar. They hit the metal bottom with a sharp, high-pitched scattering sound, like a handful of raw gemstone chips tossed onto an anvil. Tink, tink, clatter, tink. The physician grasps the heavy brass pestle. The metal is cool to the touch, contrasting sharply with the ambient warmth of the room. They bring it down directly into the center of the resin shards. The first impact is sharp and decisive. Crack. A large, stubborn piece of golden rosin shatters beneath the weight of the brass. The physician does not strike again. Instead, they begin the slow, agonizingly repetitive process of grinding. They press the rounded head of the pestle hard against the bottom of the bowl, pinning the fractured resin beneath it, and begin to move their hand in a tight, forceful circle. Screech, grind, crunch. The sound is entirely different from the soft, crumbling noise of dried leaves. This is a hard, mineral sound, the acoustic equivalent of chewing on ice. The brass pestle forces the resin against the brass bowl, shattering the crystalline structures of the dried sap. Crunch, grind, scrape. As the pieces break down, the sound changes, softening from a sharp crackling into a heavy, gritty squeal. The friction generates a small amount of localized heat, and immediately the air is filled with a new, overwhelmingly potent wave of fragrance. It is the raw, uncut scent of the ancient forest. Sharp, medicinal pine, deep, dusty earth, and a bright, almost citrus-like tang of pure frankincense. It is a smell that clears the sinuses instantly, heavy and incredibly clean. The grinding continues minute after minute. The physician leans into the motion, letting the weight of their shoulder drive the pestle, saving the muscles of their arm from unnecessary strain. The motion becomes a pendulum swing of the upper body, entirely rhythmic and mesmerizing. Grind, squeak, scrape. Grind, squeak, scrape. The powder begins to form. It is a pale, creamy yellow, fine as wheat flour but possessing a strange, sticky density. It clings stubbornly to the sides of the brass bowl and coats the rounded end of the pestle. The physician must pause regularly to scrape the powder back down into the center. They use the flat edge of the horn scraper, dragging it down the curved interior of the mortar. Sh-ring, sh-ring. The horn against the brass produces a soft, ringing tone, a momentary musical interlude in the heavy, grinding symphony. Once the resin is reduced to an absolute uniform powder with no remaining grit or crystalline shards, the physician sets the heavy pestle aside. The brass rings faintly as the tool is laid down. The next step requires extreme delicacy. A small, dark glass vial, no taller than a thumb, is pulled from a wooden rack. It has a narrow neck and a perfectly fitted cork stopper. Beside the vial, the physician places a tiny funnel, carved from thin, translucent sheep's horn. The funnel is inserted into the neck of the dark glass vial. To transfer the sticky powder, the physician uses a small, stiff brush made of bound boar bristles. They gently sweep the fine, yellow dust from the bottom of the brass mortar. The bristles make a soft, dry, scratching sound against the metal. Scritch, sweep, scritch. The gathered powder is tapped carefully into the wide mouth of the horn funnel. It does not flow easily. Its slight tackiness causes it to clump. The physician must use the very tip of the horn scraper to gently coax the powder down through the narrow spout. Tap, tap, shh. It falls into the dark glass vial with a muted, powdery silence. This process is repeated until the brass mortar is perfectly clean, its interior wiped free of all resin dust, and the dark glass vial is filled to the very brim. The tiny cork stopper is retrieved, pressed firmly into the neck of the vial, and twisted with a soft, squeaking thwomp to ensure an airtight seal. The vial is returned to its precise place in the wooden rack. The task is finished. The physical exertion of grinding, though slight, coupled with the immense baking heat of the oak log, has created a subtle dryness in the back of the physician's throat. They slowly rise from the chair, the heavy wool of the long robe falling back into place around their legs. They walk toward the back of the room, away from the intense sphere of the hearth's heat, toward the cool, shadowed stones near the pantry door. Resting on a small, three-legged stand is a large, porous clay jug covered with a damp linen cloth. The slow evaporation of the moisture from the cloth keeps the water inside the jug pleasantly cool, even in the stifling warmth of the apothecary. The physician lifts the heavy clay jug, feeling the rough, unglazed texture of the ceramic beneath their palms. They remove the damp linen cloth, draping it over the edge of the wooden stand. Next to the jug sits a simple, carved wooden cup. The jug is tilted, and the water flows out in a thick, clear, heavy stream. Glug, splash, trill. The sound is incredibly refreshing, a liquid melody in the dry, dust-scented air. The physician fills the wooden cup, sets the heavy jug down, and brings the cup to their lips. The water is perfectly still, tasting faintly of deep earth and clean stone. It is swallowed slowly, methodically, feeling the cool liquid track down the throat and into the warmth of the chest. 3 long, deliberate swallows. The cup is emptied, set back upon the stand with a hollow, wooden tock, and the damp linen cloth is carefully replaced over the mouth of the clay jug. Refreshed, the physician turns their attention upward. The ceiling of the keep is supported by massive, hand-hewn beams of black oak, darkened by centuries of wood smoke. Hanging from these ancient beams, suspended by thin lengths of twisted hemp, are dozens of bundles of dried herbs and medicinal flowers. They hang upside down, a dense, inverted forest of pale greens, dusty grays, and faded purples. It is necessary to routinely check these bundles to ensure the ambient moisture of the room, generated by the boiling kettle and the dampness of the stone, has not compromised their crisp, perfectly preserved state. Directly beneath a cluster of heavy bundles, the physician positions a small, sturdy step stool made of jointed pine. They step up, the wood groaning softly under their weight. Creak. Now elevated, their head is near the ceiling, where the air is noticeably warmer and completely saturated with the complex, interwoven scents of 100 different dried plants. The smell is dusty, papery, and intensely botanical. The physician reaches out toward a large bundle of dried mugwort. The leaves are a pale, silvery green, long and deeply lobed. With incredibly gentle fingers, they grasp the very tip of one hanging leaf. They apply the slightest pressure, testing its brittleness. The leaf responds with a sharp, dry, papery snap. Crack, rustle. The sound is perfect. It is the sound of absolute desiccation. The plant is perfectly preserved. The physician rubs the broken piece of leaf between their thumb and forefinger. It crumbles instantly into a fine, fragrant dust, releasing a sudden, sharp burst of bitter, herbal aroma. The dust falls gently through the warm air, settling invisibly onto the floorboards below. They move their hands through the bundle, gently separating the stalks to ensure air can flow freely between them. The dried stems rub against one another, creating a continuous whispering rustle, like dry wheat shifting in a gentle summer breeze. SSSSSSHH, rustle, whisper. They move to the next bundle, a thick collection of yarrow with its tiny, umbrella-like clusters of faded white flowers. The stems are stiffer, more woody. The physician checks the hemp string binding the stems together. The string has loosened slightly as the plant matter shrank during the drying process. With slow, deliberate movements, they untie the rough knot. The stiff twine protests with a dry squeak. They pull the string tight, gathering the woody stems closer together, and retie the knot with firm, unhurried precision. They run their palm gently over the dried flower heads. Brush, crinkle. They feel like stiff, tiny brushes, perfectly dry and ready for the mortar when the time comes. Satisfied with the condition of the ceiling inventory, the physician steps down from the pine stool. Creak, thud. They return the stool to its place against the far wall. The room remains in a state of perfect, undisturbed equilibrium. The fire bakes. The water clock drips. The beeswax candle casts its motionless, golden light. The vast, freezing emptiness of the winter storm continues its silent siege against the 3-foot-thick granite walls. But inside, there is only the slow, rhythmic pulse of mundane chores, the heavy scent of crushed resin and dried yarrow, and the deep, profound safety of absolute isolation. The physician walks slowly back toward the heat of the hearth, ready to simply sit, to breathe, and to let the endless, quiet hours of the night wash over them in a wave of warm, uninterrupted monotony. The heavy oak chair accepts the physician's returning weight with a deep, familiar, and comforting wooden groan. Creak, settle. The thick, undyed wool of the long robe immediately pools around the ankles once more, re-establishing the heavy, insulating barrier against the slightly cooler air that hovers an inch above the floorboards. The heat from the massive oak log in the hearth is absolute. It does not flicker or dance. It simply radiates outward in a solid, unyielding wall of deep thermal energy. The physician leans back into the tall, rigid backrest of the chair, feeling the heat seep through the layers of wool, penetrating the linen tunic beneath, and finally sinking deeply into the muscles of the back and shoulders. It is a heavy, baking warmth that induces a profound sense of physical lethargy. The eyes grow heavy, mesmerized by the glowing, grid-like pattern of the red-hot embers. The world outside the thick granite walls is a freezing, chaotic void of endless, falling snow. But inside this specific, localized pocket of existence, there is nothing but perfect stillness and intense, protective heat. The physician extends their legs toward the stone hearth, observing the heavy, thick-soled boots that encase their feet. These boots are a vital component of the protective garments, designed to wade through the treacherous, contaminated muck of the outside world, though they have not tasted the snow in many days. They are constructed of thick, boiled ox hide, reaching midway up the calf, and fastened with long, stiff leather thongs. The leather is dark, scarred, and completely rigid, possessing a dull, matte finish that speaks of heavy wear and exposure to the elements. Around the thick seams and the heavy welts of the soles, a thin layer of pale, dried mud clings stubbornly to the stitching. It is entirely dry, having been baked into a hard, dusty crust by the constant proximity to the fire. The maintenance of the leather is not just a chore. It is a vital necessity for survival, but in the absolute safety of the keep, it transforms into simply another slow, methodical way to pass the empty hours. The physician leans forward, the wool of their robe shifting with a soft, heavy rustle. Swoosh, drag. They reach down and begin to unlace the right boot. The leather thongs are thick and stiff, requiring a firm, deliberate pull to loosen them from the heavy brass eyelets. Squeak, pull, thread. The sound of the stiff leather rubbing against itself is a deep, resonant creaking, like the rigging of an ancient ship slowly swaying in a calm harbor. The knots are untied, the laces pulled slack, and the physician grips the heel of the heavy boot, pulling it firmly from their foot. Thwump. The foot, encased in its thick, soft, hand-knitted woolen stocking, is suddenly exposed to the intense heat of the fire, a wave of sudden warmth that contrasts sharply with the heavy confinement of the boot. The physician places the heavy right boot upside down upon their lap, the thick nailed leather sole facing upward. Beside the oak chair rests a small, rectangular wooden box, constructed of rough-hewn pine and held together with wooden dowels rather than iron nails. The physician opens the box. It does not have hinges, only a sliding wooden lid that fits perfectly into carved grooves. Scrape, slee-eyed clack. The lid is removed and set gently on the floor. Inside the box sits a collection of brushes and tins dedicated solely to the care of thick leather. The physician selects a heavy wooden brush. The handle is carved to perfectly fit the palm of the hand, and the bristles are made of incredibly stiff, densely packed boar hair. The bristles are a mottled gray and brown, rough to the touch, and possessing a faint, dusty smell of dry earth and old wax. Grasping the boot firmly by the heel with the left hand, the physician brings the stiff boar bristle brush down against the dried mud caked along the sole's welt. They begin to brush with short, forceful, repetitive strokes. Scritch, scratch, scritch, scratch. The sound is incredibly dry and harsh, a rapid, rhythmic grating that echoes slightly in the quiet room. The stiff bristles dig into the crevices of the thick leather, dislodging the pale, dried mud. The dirt breaks apart instantly, disintegrating into a fine gray powder that cascades downward, falling onto the dark oak floorboards like a miniature, dusty snowfall. Brush, scuff, scrape. The physician works methodically around the entire perimeter of the sole, entirely focused on the mundane task of removing every microscopic particle of dried earth. The friction of the brush against the thick ox hide creates a low, hollow thumping sound beneath the sharp scratching of the bristles. Once the welt is perfectly clear of dirt, the physician turns their attention to the broad, scarred surface of the upper leather. The brushing here is broader, sweeping in long, even arcs across the toe and up the stiff, cylindrical shaft of the boot. Swoosh, scratch, swoosh, scratch. The dry bristles drag across the matte surface, sweeping away the invisible layer of ambient dust that settles upon all things in the quiet room. The leather begins to look slightly less dull, the friction warming the residual oils locked deep within the hide. The process is entirely monotonous, a simple application of physical effort that requires absolutely no complex thought, leaving the mind entirely free to drift within the boundaries of the warm, fire-lit chamber. Satisfied that the right boot is entirely free of dust and debris, the physician places the stiff brush back into the pine box. Clack. They reach in again and retrieve a small, round tin made of thin, beaten copper. The tin is surprisingly heavy for its size. The lid is pressed on tightly, requiring the physician to wedge their thumbnail under the rim and pry it upward with a slow, firm pressure. Pop. The copper lid comes free, releasing a sudden, intense aroma. It is the heavy, rich scent of pure, rendered neatsfoot oil mixed with a generous portion of dense, yellow beeswax and a small amount of dark pine pitch. It smells of animals, deep forests, and heavy, waterproof preservation. The salve inside the tin is a solid, pale amber paste, perfectly smooth and opaque. Because the room is so intensely warm, the salve is already soft, but it requires the specific heat of human skin to reach the perfect consistency for application. The physician pulls a small, ragged square of heavily worn linen from the pine box. The cloth is deeply stained with years of accumulated oil and wax, turning it a mottled, dark brown. They wrap the cloth tightly around their right index and middle fingers, creating a firm, padded applicator. They press their cloth-covered fingers deep into the amber paste. The salve yields instantly, coating the linen in a thick, greasy layer of waterproof nourishment. The physician brings the coated fingers to the toe of the heavy oxhide boot. They press the salve against the dry, matte leather and begin to rub it in using a continuous, unyielding circular motion. Squeak, rub, squelch. The sound is entirely different from the dry scratching of the brush. It is a heavy, wet, frictionless gliding sound. The thick oil immediately begins to penetrate the dry pores of the leather. Wherever the cloth touches, the pale, scarred hide instantly transforms into a deep, rich, lustrous black. The transformation is deeply satisfying, a visible restoration of flexibility and strength. Round and round, press and rub. The physician's arm moves in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. They work the heavy oil into the deep creases where the ankle bends, pressing extra salve into the thick linen stitches to ensure they remain entirely waterproof. The scent of the neatsfoot oil and pine pitch fills the immediate space, mixing with the wood smoke from the hearth to create an atmosphere of heavy, practical industry. The leather drinks the oil greedily, becoming softer and more pliable beneath the pressure of the fingers. The quiet squeaking of the oiled rag against the boot is the only sound in the room, aside from the ever-present, low roar of the oak log and the distant, rhythmic plink. Plink. Plink of the water clock in the shadowed corner. The physician takes their time, reapplying the salve to the rag again and again, ensuring every single square inch of the right boot is heavily coated, deeply nourished, and perfectly sealed against the terrible, frozen dampness of the world beyond the heavy oak door. After nearly 20 minutes of continuous circular rubbing, the right boot is finished. It sits heavily in the lap, gleaming with a dark, oily sheen in the firelight. It looks revitalized, a formidable piece of armor ready to face the deepest snowdrifts, though it will only be set aside. The physician reaches down, carefully sliding the freshly oiled boot back onto their foot. The thick wool stocking slides easily against the smooth, softened interior leather. They pull the thick leather thongs tight. Squeak, stretch, pull. The laces are tied in a heavy, secure knot, and the foot is rested back upon the stone hearth. The entire process, the unlacing, the brushing, the oiling, and the relacing, is immediately repeated with the left boot. The motions are exactly the same. The sounds are exactly the same. The slow, methodical passage of time is marked only by the shifting of the deep, rich sheen from the tin of salve to the heavy leather of the footwear. With both boots fully treated, their dark, polished surfaces reflecting the orange glow of the embers, the physician places the lid back onto the copper tin. Press, snap. The oily linen rag is dropped back into the pine box, and the wooden lid is slid firmly into place. Slee-eyed clack. The task of maintaining the physical barrier against the outside world is complete for the evening. Yet the hands, now warm and slightly slick with the residue of the beeswax and oil, seek another simple motion to occupy the long, slow stretch of the night. The physician rises slowly from the chair. The heavy boots, now soft and supple, flex silently with each step across the dark oak floorboards. Pad, flex, pad, flex. They walk toward a large, woven willow basket resting near the heavy wooden cabinet. The basket is immense, tightly woven from thick, pale willow branches, and smells faintly of dry wood and old river water. Inside the basket lies a massive, chaotic mound of clean, rough-spun linen strips. These are the bandages, washed in the distant heat of the summer, boiled in heavy iron cauldrons with strong lye soap, and hung in the blazing sun until they were bone dry, incredibly stiff, and completely devoid of any scent save for the pure, dusty smell of dry, sun-baked fabric. The physician reaches into the basket and pulls forth a long, trailing strip of the pale linen. It is perhaps 3 fingers wide and several yards long. The fabric is stiff, crumpled, and deeply creased from being stored in the heavy pile. To be useful, to be stored properly, these strips must be rolled into perfect, tightly wound cylinders. The physician carries the trailing strip of linen back to the chair by the fire, sitting down and allowing the long tail of the fabric to pool upon the floorboards. They take the very end of the linen strip between their thumbs and forefingers. The fabric is rough, slightly abrasive against the skin. They fold the edge over once, pressing the crease flat. They fold it again, creating a tiny, dense core of fabric. Then the rolling begins. The thumbs push the fabric upward while the fingers pull it taut. Stretch, roll, tuck. The physician rolls the linen tightly around the tiny core. The sound of the dry, stiff fabric bending and stretching is a continuous, soft, rustling friction. SSSSHH, crinkle, pull. It is a sound of pure texture. As the cylinder grows, the tension must be perfectly maintained. The left hand holds the growing roll securely, while the right hand pulls the trailing strip of linen tight, ensuring there are no wrinkles or slack within the layers. Pull, stretch, roll. The roll becomes thicker, heavier, transforming from a loose, chaotic strip of cloth into a dense, solid disc of pristine white linen. The physician's eyes trace the perfect spiral of the fabric as it winds around itself, a mesmerizing geometry of simple lines and unbroken circles. The motion of the hands is incredibly precise, a miniature, localized dance of thumbs and fingers that requires intense focus on the physical sensation of tension and release. When the entire length of the strip has been wound, the physician holds a perfect, hard cylinder of linen. It is tight enough to be used as a solid object. To secure it, they pull a small piece of thin hemp twine from a pocket in the heavy wool robe. They wrap the twine around the circumference of the rolled bandage, tying it off with a simple, tight knot. Squeal, snap. The sound of the stiff twine tightening against the dry linen is sharp and brief. The perfect roll is then set upon the oak table, directly beneath the warm, golden light of the beeswax candle. The physician stands, walks back to the willow basket, and retrieves another crumpled strip of linen. Rustle, drag, they return to the chair. They fold the edge. They begin to roll, stretch, pull, crinkle, SSSSHH. The process is identical to the first. There are dozens of strips in the basket, representing hours of uninterrupted, perfectly monotonous labor. The physician does not count them. They do not look to see how many remain. They simply focus on the strip in their hands, the rough texture of the sun-baked linen, the tension of the roll, and the steady, rhythmic rustling of the fabric. The stack of perfect, cylindrical bandages on the table slowly begins to grow, a neat, orderly pyramid of pale linen that stands in stark, comforting contrast to the chaotic, swirling blizzard that howls silently against the thick granite walls of the keep. The fire continues its heavy, baking burn. The water clock drips its endless, watery tear. Plink. The slow, heavy, hypnotic routine of the night spins onward, entirely undisturbed. The final strip of rough-spun linen has been meticulously rolled, its edge tucked perfectly beneath the tight, securing loop of hemp twine. The physician's hands, pale and slightly dry from the hours of continuous rhythmic friction, come to a gentle, resting halt upon their lap. On the dark, scarred surface of the oak table, directly beneath the warm, unwavering, golden halo of the beeswax candle, sits a perfectly constructed pyramid of clean, white cylindrical bandages. The base of the pyramid is wide and stable, the layers stacking upwards in absolute, faultless geometric precision. The light from the candle catches the tiny, overlapping ridges of the tightly wound fabric, casting microscopic, crescent-shaped shadows that highlight the incredible tension of each individual roll. The pile is completely uniform, an undeniable physical testament to the slow, methodical passage of time, and the profound comfort found in deeply repetitive, entirely necessary labor. The willow basket by the heavy wooden cabinet is now completely empty, its pale, woven sides holding only the faint, dusty scent of dry, sun-baked cloth and old river water. The physician leans back into the unyielding, heavy backrest of the oak chair, allowing a long, slow breath to escape their lips. The sound is a soft, rushing sigh that blends perfectly with the low, continuous roar of the massive oak log baking in the hearth. Ha! The intense, radiant heat from the glowing bed of embers presses against the front of the heavy wool robe, a solid, invisible wall of pure thermal comfort that sinks deep into the chest and shoulders, coaxing the muscles into a state of absolute, heavy lethargy. The room remains in its state of perfect, undisturbed equilibrium. The winter storm outside the 3-foot-thick granite walls continues its silent, frozen siege, but the thick, frosted glass of the deeply recessed window reveals nothing but absolute, impenetrable blackness. The world beyond the keep does not exist. There is only this room, this fire, and the slow, endless procession of mundane protective tasks. With a slow, deliberate shifting of weight, the physician rises from the chair. The heavy, freshly oiled oxhide boots flex silently against the thick floorboards, the leather now perfectly supple and completely waterproof. Flex, pad, flex, pad. They step away from the immediate baking heat of the hearth, moving toward a small, incredibly sturdy side table constructed of dark, polished mahogany. Resting upon this table is a heavy, rectangular casket bound in thick straps of blackened iron. This is the repository for the delicate tools of the trade, the implements that require an entirely different level of care and maintenance than the heavy leather coats or the rough linen bandages. The box is made of dense, aged rosewood, its surface smooth and entirely unadorned, save for a small, intricate brass keyhole set flush into the front panel. The physician reaches into the deep, heavy pocket of their wool robe and retrieves a single, small brass key. The metal of the key is cold, having absorbed the slightly lower ambient temperature of the room's outer edges. It is a complex key, its teeth filed into a series of precise, asymmetrical notches designed to navigate the heavy, internal tumblers of the iron lock. The physician inserts the cold brass key into the keyhole. Scrape, clink. The fit is absolutely perfect, leaving no room for the metal to rattle or shake. With a slow, firm twist of the wrist, they turn the key. The mechanical action is deeply satisfying. The hidden tumblers inside the lock resist for a fraction of a second before yielding to the precise pressure of the brass teeth. Click, clack, thunk. The heavy internal bolt slides back, releasing the lid of the casket with a deep, muffled sound of heavy iron shifting against itself. The physician places their hands upon the lid and lifts. The heavy iron hinges at the back of the casket groan softly, a low metallic creak that speaks of immense weight and tight engineering. Kriyak. As the box opens, a new complex scent spills out into the warm, wood smoke-filled air of the room. It is a clean, sharp, almost sterile smell. A profound mixture of camphor, bitter clove oil, polished steel, and the faint, metallic tang of cold, tarnished silver. The interior of the heavy rosewood casket is completely lined with deep, rich crimson velvet. The fabric is incredibly soft, its thick pile crushed flat in specific, meticulously carved grooves designed to cradle each individual instrument perfectly. The physician looks down into the casket. Nestled within the crimson velvet are several heavy, blunt instruments. There are no sharp blades here, no terrifying scalpels or saws. These are the tools of gentle examination and careful mixing. There are smooth, rounded silver probes, flat, heavy spatulas made of polished steel, and small, deep spoons with long, elegantly twisted handles. Over the past weeks of disuse, the ambient dampness that inevitably seeps through the ancient stone walls, despite the roaring fire, has caused a faint, dull bloom of tarnish to form upon the surface of the silver. It is a microscopic layer of oxidation, turning the bright, reflective metal into a flat, cloudy gray. It is completely unacceptable. From a small, square compartment in the corner of the casket, the physician extracts a folded square of yellow chamois leather. The leather is incredibly soft, almost fluid in its flexibility, and possesses a strong, musky smell of natural animal oils. Beside the chamois sits a tiny, corked bottle of clear, pale oil pressed from bitter almonds. The physician uncorks the tiny bottle. Pop. The smell of the almonds is sharp, sweet, and intensely nutty. They press the open mouth of the bottle against the center of the soft yellow chamois and tip it briefly, allowing a single, heavy drop of the oil to soak into the porous leather. They return the cork to the bottle and set it aside. With extreme care, the physician reaches into the crimson velvet and lifts the first instrument. It is a long, heavy silver spatula, perfectly smooth and entirely blunt, used for mixing thick salves on glass plates. The silver is cold to the touch, heavy in the hand, its surface clouded by the pale gray tarnish. The physician holds the heavy handle of the spatula in their left hand, gripping it firmly. In their right hand, they hold the oiled center of the soft chamois leather. They wrap the leather tightly around the broad, flat blade of the silver tool and begin to rub. The motion is slow, applying deep, heavy pressure. Squeak, rub, glide. The sound is entirely different from the harsh brushing of the leather boots. This is a high-pitched, smooth friction, the sound of soft leather slipping over cold metal. As the physician rubs, the sweet almond oil begins to break down the microscopic layer of oxidation. Squeal, rub, swoosh. The back and forth motion is perfectly rhythmic, a pendulum swing of the right hand. With each pass of the chamois, the cloudy gray tarnish is wiped away, transferring itself to the yellow leather as a dark, charcoal-colored smudge. Beneath the tarnish, the true, brilliant nature of the pure silver is revealed. The physician continues to polish, focusing entirely on the flat plane of the blade. The friction generates a tiny, localized pocket of heat, slowly warming the cold metal of the spatula until it matches the temperature of the physician's skin. The silver begins to gleam, catching the ambient, golden light of the distant beeswax candle. The metal becomes a perfect, curved mirror, reflecting a distorted, miniature image of the warm, fire-lit room. The physician flips the tool over, turning their attention to the long, twisted handle. The chamois is pressed deep into the spiraled grooves of the metal, the thumb applying intense pressure to ensure every fraction of an inch is perfectly polished. Squeak, twist, squeak, twist. The sound is mesmerizing, a tiny metallic song that fills the quiet space near the side table. Once the silver spatula is absolutely flawless, radiating a warm, perfect shine, it is carefully lowered back into its specific molded depression within the deep crimson velvet. It rests there, gleaming brightly against the dark red fabric. The physician moves on to the next tool. It is a heavy, rounded silver probe, perfectly smooth and entirely blunt, ending in a solid, teardrop-shaped bulb of pure metal. The process begins again. The drop of sweet almond oil, the tight grip, the slow, heavy pressure of the chamois leather, squeak, rub, glide, the methodical removal of the cloudy gray tarnish, the slow, satisfying reveal of the bright, reflective silver beneath. Tool by tool, the physician works their way through the heavy iron-bound casket. The repetitiveness of the task is profoundly grounding. There is no thought required, only the steady application of pressure, the satisfying transformation of the metal, and the endless, hypnotic squeaking of the oiled leather. Time simply ceases to matter. The water clock in the corner continues to mark the passing minutes with its hollow, watery plink. Plink. Plink, but the sound merely blends into the background, becoming part of the heavy, silent tapestry of the room. The air around the side table becomes thick with the scent of bitter almond oil and polished metal. The yellow chamois leather grows progressively darker, covered in overlapping smudges of black tarnish, while the tools within the crimson velvet grow progressively brighter, a collection of perfect, shining silver implements resting in absolute readiness. When the final silver spoon has been polished to a flawless mirror finish and returned to its velvet bed, the physician folds the blackened chamois leather and tucks it back into its square compartment. They close the heavy rosewood lid of the casket. The thick iron hinges groan once more, descending with a slow, heavy gravity until the lid meets the base with a solid, definitive thud. The brass key is inserted into the lock. Clink. The wrist turns. The heavy internal tumblers resist, then fall into place. Thunk, clack. The lock is secured. The key is withdrawn and returned to the deep pocket of the wool robe. The delicate tools are safe, clean, and perfectly sealed away. The physical exertion of the polishing, combined with the incredibly dry baking heat of the hearth fire, has caused a subtle irritation in the very back of the physician's throat. It is a dry, scratchy sensation, born of breathing the superheated, wood smoke-scented air for hours on end. It requires a remedy, another simple, methodical preparation to occupy the hands and soothe the body. The physician turns away from the mahogany side table and walks slowly toward the cool, deeply shadowed expanse of the pantry built into the thickest part of the stone wall. The heavy iron latch of the oak door yields with its familiar, loud clack, and the heavy hinges groan as the door is pulled open. Stepping into the cooler air of the pantry, the physician inhales the earthy scent of dry roots and hanging meats. They reach toward a high wooden shelf, their fingers brushing past rough burlap sacks and sealed clay amphorae. They locate a small, heavy pot made of glazed stoneware. It is sealed with a thick disc of solid cork and bound with a piece of heavy twine. Beside it, they pick up a small, tightly woven linen pouch. They carry both items back into the profound warmth of the main chamber, pushing the heavy oak pantry door shut behind them with a solid boom that echoes briefly against the stone ceiling. The physician carries the items to the large oak work table. They set the heavy stoneware pot down. It lands with a dull, solid thud. They untie the twine and pry the thick cork stopper free. The smell that rises from the pot is incredible. It is the heavy, concentrated essence of pure, crystallized summer honey. It smells of thousands of distant wildflowers, bright sunlight, and deep, sugary sweetness. Over the long, freezing months in the cold pantry, the honey has completely solidified, turning from a viscous liquid into a dense, pale yellow crystal mass. It is hard, opaque, and entirely immovable. To make the soothing pastilles for the throat, this crystal mass must be melted, transformed back into a thick, workable syrup. The physician retrieves a very small, heavy-bottomed skillet made of solid copper, its interior lined with a thin, bright layer of protective tin. Using a heavy wooden spoon, they dig into the solid honey. The sound is a loud, gritty crunching. CRRK, scrape, CRRK. The crystallized sugar resists the wood, breaking apart in thick, pale yellow shards. The physician scoops a generous mound of the hard honey into the center of the copper skillet. The solid chunks clatter against the tin lining with a hollow, metallic sound. Clatter, clink. The skillet is carried to the hearth. The physician does not place the copper directly onto the glowing red coals. The heat is far too intense and would instantly burn the delicate sugars. Instead, they position a heavy iron trivet at the very edge of the stone hearth, where the ambient heat radiates powerfully, but the direct flames cannot reach. They place the copper skillet upon the iron trivet. Now, the waiting begins again. The physician sits upon the three-legged wooden stool, drawing their knees up close to their chest, wrapping the thick wool robe tightly around their body, and simply watches the physics of heat transfer take hold. For a long time, nothing happens. The pale yellow shards of honey simply sit within the copper, completely inert. The room is silent, save for the low roar of the oak log and the ticking clock. Then, incredibly slowly, the sharp edges of the honey crystals begin to soften. They lose their rigid geometric shapes, slumping downward, melting into a thick, golden pool at the bottom of the skillet. The transition is agonizingly slow. The solid chunks gradually reduce in size, sinking into the rising tide of liquid amber. As the honey fully melts, its color deepens, shifting from pale, opaque yellow to a rich, translucent gold. The heat of the fire awakens the dormant floral oils trapped within the sugar, and the air around the hearth is suddenly filled with a heavy, intoxicating perfume of warm blossoms and deep, syrupy sweetness. The physician watches the liquid closely. It must not boil. As soon as the very first tiny bubble forms at the edge of the copper, a microscopic dome of expanding air that pops with a tiny, wet blip, the physician uses a thick piece of felt to lift the skillet from the trivet. They carry the hot, liquid honey back to the work table. The scent is now overwhelming, a thick, comforting cloud of pure warmth. Now the medicinal element must be added. The physician unties the small linen pouch they brought from the pantry. Inside is a fine, dusty powder, perfectly dry and pale beige in color. It is the finely ground inner bark of the slippery elm tree, a mucilaginous substance incredibly soothing to inflamed tissues. Using a tiny, carved wooden scoop, the physician takes a measure of the soft powder. They tilt the scoop over the steaming copper skillet. The pale dust falls perfectly into the center of the dark golden honey. It sits upon the surface tension for a brief moment before beginning to sink. Using the handle of the wooden spoon, the physician begins to stir. The motion is slow, deliberate, and entirely circular. Swish, drag, swish. As the dry powder mixes with the hot liquid, the consistency of the honey begins to change immediately. It thickens rapidly, transforming from a loose syrup into a heavy, viscous paste. The stirring becomes more difficult, requiring a firm, steady pressure. The sound changes from a light sloshing to a heavy, wet folding noise. Squelch, fold, drag. The slippery elm powder absorbs the moisture, creating a smooth, incredibly sticky, dark amber compound. The smell is now a perfect balance. The deep, sugary sweetness of the hot honey mixed with the mild, dusty, woody scent of the tree bark. The mixture is perfect. It is dense, heavy, and cooling rapidly. The physician takes a small, rectangular sheet of heavy parchment paper, previously coated with a microscopically thin layer of pure beeswax, and lays it flat upon the oak table. Using a tiny pewter spoon, they scoop up a small amount of the thick, sticky paste. They hold the spoon over the parchment and use the tip of their finger to push the heavy droplet off the metal. The thick paste falls. Plop. It lands upon the waxed parchment, spreading slightly into a perfect, uniform golden dome. The physician repeats the process. Scoop, push, fall, plop. Scoop, push, fall, plop. The sound is incredibly rhythmic, a heavy, sticky metronome. The drops are placed in perfectly straight, equidistant rows across the parchment paper. Each tiny pastille is exactly the same size as the last, a glowing amber jewel of hardened honey and soothing bark. The task requires intense visual focus and incredibly steady hands, ensuring each drop falls perfectly, creating a beautiful, orderly grid of medicinal comfort. As the pastilles cool against the ambient air of the room, they begin to harden, their glossy surfaces reflecting the distant, dancing light of the hearth fire in tiny, identical pinpricks of orange flame. The physician continues to drop the thick paste, row after row, lost entirely in the slow, sweet, mesmerizing repetition of the work. safe within the profound, impenetrable silence of the heavy stone keep. The grid of perfectly formed, medicinal honey pastilles rests upon the thin, translucent sheet of beeswax-coated parchment. The incredibly dry baking heat of the room has drawn the residual moisture from the dark amber paste, cooling the liquid sugars and the soothing bark powder until they have formed solid, crystalline domes. The physician remains seated at the heavy oak work table, the faint, sweet scent of the hardened honey mingling with the deep, ever-present aroma of wood smoke and the sharp, clean smell of polished silver that still lingers in the air. The small, heavy-bottomed copper skillet has cooled completely, its tin-lined interior coated in a thin, hard glaze of residual sugar. The task now is to harvest the pastilles, to transfer them from the flat expanse of the parchment to a small, secure container where they will await their slow, methodical consumption. The physician reaches for a small, shallow box constructed of thin, pliable strips of pale birch wood, woven together tightly like a miniature basket, and lined with a square of clean, dry linen. The box is incredibly light, weighing almost nothing in the palm of the hand. They place the empty birch box directly beside the parchment paper. With slow, deliberate movements, the physician presses the tip of their right index finger against the very edge of the wax paper, holding it firmly against the dark grain of the oak table. With their left hand, they gently slip the thin, curved edge of their horn scraper beneath the first golden pastille. The hardened honey resists for a fraction of a second before the microscopic bond between the sugar and the wax is broken. Snap peel. The sound is incredibly sharp, yet tiny, a microscopic tearing noise that echoes faintly in the quiet room. The pastille pops free from the parchment, a perfect, smooth hemisphere of dark, solid amber. The physician picks it up. It is cold to the touch, dense and hard as a pebble, yet it retains a microscopic surface tackiness that creates a tiny friction against the skin. They drop the pastille into the birch box. It lands against the dry linen lining with a muted, soft clink. They move to the next pastille in the row. The horn scraper slides beneath the edge. Snap peel, the tiny, satisfying release of the sugar from the wax. The pastille is lifted and dropped. Clink. The process is deeply, profoundly repetitive. Snap, peel, clink. The physician's hands move in a steady, hypnotic rhythm, clearing the long, straight rows of golden drops one by one. The sound of the pastilles gathering in the birch box changes as the pile grows, shifting from a soft, muffled tapping against the linen to a sharp, crystalline clattering as the hard candies strike one another. Clatter, clink, tap. It is the sound of gathering provisions, of securing a small, mundane comfort against the endless, dry heat of the deep winter quarantine. As the parchment is slowly cleared, the grid pattern remains visible as a series of tiny, perfectly round indentations in the thin layer of beeswax. The physician does not rush. There is absolute pleasure to be found in the slow, tactile sensation of popping each individual drop free, feeling its weight, and adding it to the growing collection. When the final pastille is dropped into the box, the sound is a heavy, satisfying cascade of shifting sugar. The physician folds the edges of the dry linen lining over the top of the pastilles, covering them completely, and presses the woven birch lid down onto the box. It fits with a soft, sliding friction. SSSSHH, click. The box is moved to the far edge of the table, ready to be stored in the dark, cool recesses of the pantry come morning. The physician leans back, pulling the heavy folds of the undyed wool robe tighter around their chest. As they adjust the thick fabric, their fingers brush against a subtle irregularity near the heavy, folded collar. It is one of the large, smooth wooden toggles used to fasten the robe across the throat when the drafts are particularly biting. The toggle is carved from dark walnut, shaped like an elongated barrel, and secured by a thick loop of heavy linen thread. The physician pulls gently on the wooden piece. It shifts loosely, the thick threads binding it to the wool having frayed slightly from constant, heavy use. It is a minor failure of the garment, barely noticeable, but in the absolute, structured order of the keep, it is an imperfection that must be immediately rectified. The physician rises, the heavy, freshly oiled oxhide boots making no sound against the thick floorboards. They walk toward a small, narrow shelf built into the stone wall near the fireplace, where a rectangular box of highly polished cherry wood sits. This is the sewing casket. It is fastened with a simple brass latch. The physician brings the box back to the table, sets it down beneath the golden light of the beeswax candle, and flicks the latch open. Clack. Inside the box is a masterpiece of compact organization. There are small wooden spools wound tightly with threads of varying thicknesses, heavy iron shears with dark, forged handles, a block of pure, hard yellow beeswax, and a small, cylindrical case carved from ivory, holding the needles. The physician opens the ivory case with a soft pop. They carefully extract a needle. It is not made of iron or steel, which would rust in the damp, ambient air of the valley, but is painstakingly carved from a sliver of incredibly dense, bleached bone. The needle is thick, designed to pierce heavy layers of wool and boiled leather. Its surface is perfectly smooth, polished to a dull shine by years of friction against rough fabrics and calloused fingertips. The eye of the bone needle is large and elongated. Next, they select a spool of heavy, unbleached linen thread, identical to the frayed fibers currently struggling to hold the walnut toggle. They pull a long, continuous length of the thick thread from the wooden spool. Squeak, unroll, pull. The thread is rough and dry. Before it can be used on the heavy wool of the robe, it must be conditioned. The physician picks up the block of pure yellow beeswax. It is deeply scarred with deep, narrow grooves from years of use. They press the end of the linen thread into one of the deep grooves and press their thumb down hard over it. With a swift, firm motion, they pull the entire length of the thread through the solid wax. Zip. The sound is a sharp, resonant vibration. The wax instantly coats the rough linen fibers, smoothing them down, rendering the thread incredibly strong, completely waterproof, and slightly stiff. They repeat the motion twice more. Zip. Zip. The thread is now perfectly prepared, heavy and smooth. Taking the heavy iron shears, the physician snips the thread from the spool. Snip. The sound of the blades crossing is a thick, metallic bite. They bring the freshly waxed tip of the thread to the eye of the bone needle. The stiffened fibers pass through the elongated opening with ease. The thread is pulled through, and the physician ties a thick, heavy knot at the very end, rolling the fibers between their thumb and forefinger to create a dense, immovable stopper. Twist, roll, pull. The physician sits back in the heavy oak chair, pulling the loose collar of the robe onto their lap. The fabric is incredibly thick, a dense, matted wall of spun sheep's fleece. They position the loose walnut toggle directly over its designated anchor point. They take a thick, heavily scarred thimble made of stiff, boiled leather and push it onto the middle finger of their right hand. The leather is hard as wood, perfectly molded to the shape of their digit. The sewing begins. The physician presses the sharp, carved tip of the bone needle against the underside of the heavy wool. The leather thimble pushes hard against the blunt end of the needle. The resistance is immense. The thick wool does not want to yield. The physician applies slow, agonizing, steady pressure. Thump, squeal. The bone pierces the dense fabric, the sound a low, heavy popping noise. As the eye of the needle passes through, it pulls the thick, waxed linen thread behind it. SSSSHHH thwump. The thread drags through the tight puncture hole with a long, satisfying, friction-heavy sigh. The thread is pulled taut, the heavy knot catching perfectly against the underside of the wool. The needle is then directed over the thick hemp loop of the walnut toggle and driven back down through the fabric. Press, pop, squeal. The bone pushes through. The needle is grasped from beneath and pulled. SSSSHHH thwump. The wax thread follows, binding the wooden barrel tightly against the robe. The physician repeats this process over and over, up through the heavy wool. Squeal, pop, dragging the thread. SSSSHHH, down over the loop. Squeal, pop, dragging the thread. SSSSHHH. The motion is profoundly hypnotic, a slow, heavy rhythm of force and friction. The room is so incredibly quiet that the sound of the thread pulling through the dense fabric seems incredibly loud. A continuous, rushing whisper that entirely commands the attention of the ears. Each stitch is pulled with absolute, unwavering tension, sinking deep into the matted fibers of the wool until the thread is practically invisible. The walnut toggle, previously loose and failing, is slowly drawn tighter and tighter against the collar, returning to a state of perfect, immovable security. The physical effort required to push the thick bone needle through the heavy garment creates a deep, satisfying ache in the muscles of the hand and forearm. A heavy, grounding sensation that perfectly matches the deep, baking heat radiating from the hearth. After a dozen incredibly tight, perfectly placed stitches, the toggle is fully secured. The physician passes the needle through the underside of the fabric one final time, looping the thread through the previous stitch and pulling it tight to form a massive, unyielding knot. Pull, stretch, snap. They take the heavy iron shears. The thick blades are opened wide, positioned carefully against the base of the knot and squeezed shut. Snip. The thread falls away. The repair is complete. The physician runs their thumb over the smooth, dark wood of the walnut toggle, pressing it firmly. It does not yield a fraction of an inch. It is perfect. The tools are slowly returned to the cherry wood box. The shears, clack, the wax, thud. The bone needle is slid back into the ivory case. Pop. The lid of the sewing casket is closed and latched. Clack. The small interruption in the absolute perfection of the room has been smoothed away. The mind, occupied by the heavy, frictional task of the needle and thread, now registers a profound, heavy wave of utter exhaustion. The day has been an endless string of slow, monotonous, incredibly detailed labors, and the physical body is finally surrendering to the overwhelming, baking heat of the hearth and the deep, silent pressure of the frozen night outside. The physician stands, the heavy wool robe falling back into its perfectly repaired, heavily draped folds. The water clock in the corner measures the profound depth of the night. Plink, plink, plink. The sound seems slower now, the gaps between the falling drops stretching out into vast, empty canyons of time. It is time to prepare the sleeping alcove. Built directly into the thickest, innermost wall of the keep, the sleeping quarters are designed for maximum thermal retention. It is not a separate room, but a deep, rectangular chamber carved into the stone, completely lined with heavy planks of dark, insulating cedar to keep the freezing chill of the granite away from the body. A thick, heavy curtain of deep green velvet, currently pulled back and tied with a thick golden cord, hangs across the entrance, ready to seal the alcove into a perfect, dark, completely warm cocoon. The physician walks slowly to the alcove. The heavy, freshly oiled boots flex softly on the floorboards. Inside the deep recess, the bed is a massive structural object. The frame is built of heavy oak timbers, laced tightly with a complex grid of thick, incredibly tense hemp ropes. Resting upon this rope foundation is the mattress. It is not a thin pad, but a massive, incredibly thick sack made of heavy, unbleached canvas ticking. Inside the canvas lies a dense, compressed mixture of thousands of soft goose feathers, dried sweetgrass, and crushed lavender flowers. Before the bed can be entered, it must be fluffed and prepared. The physician leans into the alcove, placing both hands flat against the heavy canvas mattress. With slow, rhythmic plunging motions, they begin to press and knead the massive sack. Whump, rustle, whump. The sound is incredibly deep and muffled. The heavy canvas squeaks against itself, while the thousands of feathers inside shift and slide, grinding softly against the dried sweetgrass. Crinkle, sssshhh, whump. The physical effort forces the compressed down to expand, drawing fresh air into the interior of the mattress and restoring its incredible, enveloping loft. As the feathers shift, a cloud of deeply relaxing fragrance is pushed through the microscopic pores of the canvas. The heavy, powdery scent of lavender mixed with the sweet, grassy smell of summer fields. Once the mattress is perfectly plumped, rising high above the wooden frame, the physician turns their attention to the bedding. They pull a massive, heavy sheet of unbleached linen over the canvas. The fabric is rough, stiff, and completely dry. They smooth it down with flat palms, pushing the wrinkles toward the edges. Swoosh, drag, swoosh. The sound of skin against heavy linen is a dry, whispering friction. Next comes the first blanket, a thick, tightly woven layer of pure white sheep's wool. It is heavy, draping over the edges of the bed with a soft, weighted thud. The physician pulls it up to the headboard, ensuring the corners are perfectly squared. Over the white wool goes a second blanket, this one dyed a deep, muted crimson using madder root. It is even heavier than the first, providing a massive, dense layer of absolute insulation. The physician smooths the red wool, the fabric catching slightly against the white layer beneath. Screech, drag, settle. Finally, the crowning layer of the bed is applied. It is a massive, heavy pelt stitched together from 3 complete, perfectly cured sheepskins. The leather underside is soft and pliable, but the top is a dense, incredibly thick jungle of curly, natural fleece. The physician grabs the edges of the heavy pelt and hauls it over the bed. It lands with a heavy, muffled whump. The weight of this final layer is immense. To sleep beneath it is to be physically pinned to the mattress, held down by a warm, unyielding embrace that entirely prevents any restless movement. The bed is fully made, a mountain of wool, linen, and fleece. However, the linens, having sat in the cool shadows of the alcove all day, are perfectly dry but entirely cold. To enter them now would be a shock to the heavily warmed system of the physician. The transition from the baking heat of the hearth to the cold sheets must be mediated. The physician turns away from the alcove and walks back toward the blazing fire. Resting against the stone mantel is a tool designed specifically for this perfect, luxurious transition. It is the bed warmer, a shallow, circular pan forged from solid, heavy brass, attached to a long, perfectly smooth handle of turned ash wood. The lid of the brass pan is hinged and pierced with dozens of intricately cut, geometric holes designed to allow heat to escape while keeping the burning fuel safely contained. The physician grips the smooth wooden handle. The brass pan is cold and heavy. They lift a small iron latch and flip the pierced lid open. It falls back with a sharp, metallic clank that rings brightly in the silent room. Taking the heavy iron tongs with their right hand, the physician turns their attention to the bed of incredibly hot, glowing red embers that surround the massive, baking oak log. They carefully select the perfect pieces of fuel, small, perfectly square cubes of pure, glowing charcoal that emit no smoke, only absolute, intense, radiating heat. Using the heavy iron tongs, they pinch a glowing red cube. Clink. They lift it from the hearth and lower it gently into the cold brass pan. As the superheated coal touches the cold metal, there is a sharp, brief hiss of pure thermal shock. HSSSSSD. The physician repeats the process, selecting a dozen small, perfectly glowing embers, transferring them one by one into the bed warmer. Clink, drop, clatter. The sound of the hard charcoal pieces striking the brass and tumbling against one another is a brittle, glass-like rattling. Once the bottom of the pan is covered in a layer of glowing red, the physician lowers the heavy iron tongs. They flip the pierced brass lid shut. Clank. The latch is secured. Instantly, the heat from the coals begins to transfer to the heavy brass. The metal warms rapidly, shifting from cold to warm, and then to incredibly, untouchably hot. Through the intricately cut holes in the lid, a thick, heavy wave of baking air rises, carrying with it the faintest, cleanest scent of pure, burned wood. Holding the long wooden handle securely, the physician carries the heavy, intensely hot brass pan back to the sleeping alcove, ready to banish the final, lingering shadows of cold from the deep, enveloping linens, preparing the ultimate sanctuary for the long, silent hours of the winter night. The physician stands before the deep, cedar-lined sleeping alcove, holding the incredibly hot, heavy brass bed warmer by its smooth, turned ash wood handle. The metal pan radiates a fierce, baking heat that presses intensely against the front of the linen tunic, a mobile pocket of pure thermal energy harvested directly from the heart of the hearth. With their free left hand, the physician reaches out and grasps the thick, heavily folded edge of the massive, madder-dyed crimson blanket, the pure white sheep's wool beneath it, and the rough, unbleached linen sheet. With a slow, heavy, coordinated lift, they peel the layers back. The immense weight of the bedding resists briefly before yielding, folding back upon itself with a deep, muffled, structural sound. Whump, rustle, thwump. The cold, crisp interior of the bed is exposed to the ambient, wood-smoke-scented air of the stone chamber. With extreme care, ensuring the glowing red charcoal cubes safely locked inside do not spill, the physician slides the flat, heavy brass pan between the cold bottom sheet and the massive, canvas-sticking mattress. The immediate reaction of the freezing, dry linen to the intense, baking heat of the brass is a profound, localized transformation. As the smooth metal glides over the woven fabric, it produces a high-pitched, continuous, dry squeal of friction. Squeak, sssshhh, glide. The sound is incredibly tactile, the acoustic manifestation of cold surrendering instantly to heat. The physician begins to move the long wooden handle in a slow, wide, completely rhythmic pendulum-like arc. Left to right to left. Swoosh, squeak. Swoosh, squeak. They guide the pan slowly down toward the very foot of the heavy oak frame, pushing it deep into the tight, tucked corners where the cold pools the deepest. They hold it there for a long, quiet minute, allowing the heat to bake into the layers of fabric, ensuring the spot where their heavy, wool-stockinged feet will eventually rest is entirely devoid of any residual chill. As the brass pan moves, the intense heat penetrates the unbleached linen sheet and reaches the thick canvas mattress below. The trapped, dry heat suddenly activates the dormant essential oils of the crushed lavender flowers and dried sweetgrass compressed within the thousands of goose feathers. Instantly, a heavy, intoxicating, powdery scent rises from the bed. It is the concentrated smell of a warm, sun-baked summer field, released directly into the freezing depths of the winter night. It smells of deep comfort, absolute safety, and heavy, dreamless sleep. The sweeping motion continues, an agonizingly slow, methodical ironing of the interior space. Glide, squeak, pause. The physician pulls the pan upward, warming the center of the bed, moving back and forth in perfect parallel lines, ensuring not a single inch of the linen remains cold. They guide it finally to the very top, resting the hot brass momentarily against the thick, feather-stuffed pillows, toasting the unbleached cases until they are warm to the touch. The entire process takes nearly 15 minutes of unbroken, hypnotic repetition. When the task is complete, the interior of the bed is a perfectly sealed pocket of intense, trapped summer heat. The physician quickly withdraws the brass pan, sliding it out with a final, long sssshhh, and instantly drops the heavy layers of wool and fleece back into place. Thwump, settle. The heat is captured. The pan, its brass now slightly cooled, but the embers inside still glowing a dull red, is carried back to the hearth and set gently upon the stone floor with a hollow, metallic clank. It is time to shed the heavy armor of the waking hours. The physician stands directly before the banked fire, the ambient heat of the room soaking into their skin. They reach down to the heavy, freshly oiled oxhide boots. The leather is now incredibly soft, entirely supple from the heavy application of neatsfoot oil and beeswax. They hook their fingers through the thick leather thongs. The knots, though secure, are easily loosened due to the lubrication of the oil. Squeak, pull, slip. The thick laces are pulled slack. The physician grips the heel of the right boot, pushing down with the toe of their left foot, and pulls. Thwump. The heavy boot slides off, releasing the thick wool stocking into the warm air. The left boot follows. Thwump. The boots, heavy and gleaming darkly in the firelight, are placed perfectly side by side upon the warm granite of the hearth. They will remain there throughout the night, the gentle, radiating heat of the stones keeping the thick leather completely soft and the protective oils entirely fluid. Next, the physician reaches for the heavy collar of the undyed wool robe. Their fingers brush against the freshly repaired, immovably secure walnut toggle. The thick, waxed linen thread holds the wood perfectly tight. They slip the heavy hemp loop off the wooden barrel. Squeak, pop. The physical release of the fastener allows the incredibly heavy, dense wool garment to fall open. The physician slips their left arm out of the wide, heavy sleeve, then their right. The sheer weight of the robe dropping away from their shoulders is a profound physical sensation. It feels as though an invisible, crushing burden has been suddenly lifted. The body feels instantaneously lighter, almost buoyant. Beneath the heavy wool, the physician wears a simple, floor-length tunic woven from fine, incredibly soft, bleached flax. The linen is thin, breathable, and perfectly smooth against the skin. Without the insulating barrier of the robe, the slightly cooler air of the room's outer edges touches the linen tunic, providing a faint, incredibly refreshing contrast to the baking heat of the immediate hearth. The physician gathers the heavy wool robe in both hands. It is a massive, unruly bundle of sheep's fleece. They carry it to a large, hand-forged iron hook driven deep into the mortar between the massive granite blocks of the wall. They heave the heavy garment upward, catching the thick collar over the iron. The robe settles against the stone with a deep, heavy, muffled thud, hanging there like a dormant, protective beast, waiting patiently for the dawn. With the heavy layers removed, the final nightly ablutions can commence. The physician walks softly in their thick wool stockings across the dark oak floorboards. Pad, pad, pad. They approach the heavy work table where the soapstone basin rests. The water inside the basin, left over from the evening dishwashing, is completely cold and perfectly still, reflecting the golden light of the solitary beeswax candle like a dark, liquid mirror. Above the hearth, suspended from the heavy iron trammel, the blackened cast-iron kettle continues to emit a microscopic, curling wisp of steam. The water inside is no longer boiling, having cooled to a deep, comfortable, radiating heat. The physician walks to the hearth, unhooks the heavy iron kettle, and carries it to the table. They tilt the spout over the cold soapstone basin. A thick, clear stream of hot water pours downward, striking the surface of the cold water with a hollow, resonant, splashing sound. Splash, gurgle, thrum. The mixing of the temperatures creates a sudden, thick cloud of clean, pure white steam that rises up to envelop the physician's face. The scent is utterly plain, the smell of pure, heated well water, devoid of any herbs, smoke, or oils. It is a profoundly grounding, entirely neutral aroma. The physician sets the heavy kettle down upon a thick iron trivet. Beside the basin sits a small, rectangular block of hard, cured lye soap. It is pale gray, mottled with tiny white flecks, and completely unscented, smelling only faintly of clean, rendered fat and white wood ash. The physician submerges their pale hands into the perfectly tepid water of the basin. The liquid is incredibly soft, washing over the skin with a heavy, fluid warmth. They pick up the hard block of soap, holding it completely underwater, and begin to rub it vigorously between their palms. Slick, rub, slosh. The friction creates a microscopic lather, a thin, incredibly slippery film that coats the skin. There are no thick, frothy bubbles, only a dense, practical slickness. They raise their hands, bringing the slippery, tepid water to their face. They press their palms against their cheeks, their forehead, and over their closed eyelids. Slosh, drip, rub. The warm water dissolves the invisible, microscopic film of dried herb dust, heavy wood smoke, and sweat that has accumulated over the long, slow hours of the day. The physical sensation of the water against the tired skin is a profound, incredibly simple luxury. It washes away the day, leaving only a deep, heavy, clean exhaustion. They rinse their face again and again, the water cascading from their chin and splashing softly back into the deep soapstone basin. Drip, splash, drip. When the skin is completely clear, the physician reaches for a perfectly dry, incredibly rough towel woven from unbleached huckaback linen. The fabric is deeply textured, covered in tiny, raised woven squares designed to absorb moisture instantly. They press the rough towel to their face. The dry friction is sharp, almost abrasive, but deeply satisfying. Scrub, pat, dry. The thick linen instantly drinks the water from the skin, leaving the face perfectly dry, slightly flushed, and completely cool. They dry their hands, ensuring every drop of moisture is removed from between the fingers. The damp towel is then carried to a small, freestanding wooden rack positioned near the edge of the hearth's heat. It is draped perfectly straight over the smooth ash wood bar, where the gentle, radiating warmth of the room will slowly dry it throughout the long, quiet night. The room is now ready to sleep, but the fire must be commanded to do the same. Leaving the massive, glowing oak log exposed to the open air of the room would cause it to burn out completely before the dawn, leaving the keep freezing and utterly dark. The fire must be banked, perfectly smothered so that it merely breathes through the night, conserving its immense heat without consuming its fuel. The physician takes up a small, heavy iron shovel with a short, blackened handle. They kneel before the intense, radiating heat of the hearth. At the very edges of the stone fireplace, far away from the active coals, lies a deep, thick bank of perfectly cold, incredibly fine, pale gray ash, the accumulated remains of months of winter fires. The physician pushes the flat blade of the iron shovel into the pile of ash. Scrape, shhh. The sound is incredibly dry and soft. They lift a heavy mound of the weightless, powdery gray dust. With extreme care, they hover the shovel over the massive, glowing, red-hot core of the oak log. With a slow, subtle twist of the wrist, they tip the blade. The pale gray ash cascades downward in a thick, continuous waterfall of dust. It lands upon the superheated coals with a soft, suffocating poof. SSSSSHH poof. Instantly, the harsh, bright orange glare of the exposed embers is muffled. The intense, radiating heat is immediately trapped beneath the thick, insulating blanket of fine ash. The physician repeats the process. Scrape, lift, pour. SSSSSHH poof. They completely bury the glowing log, covering every single visible speck of red light, until the hearth appears completely cold and dead, a simple, gray, conical mound of soft dust. However, beneath that pale gray exterior, the massive oak log continues to smolder with an incredible, terrifying, invisible heat. The ash perfectly restricts the flow of oxygen, slowing the combustion to a microscopic, agonizing crawl. It will burn like this for 12 hours, a sleeping dragon of pure thermal energy. With the fire banked, the ambient light in the room shifts dramatically. The bright, dancing orange glow that previously illuminated the heavy oak beams and the thick stone walls vanishes instantly. The room is suddenly plunged into a deep, heavy, velvet darkness, broken only by the single, solitary, perfectly still golden flame of the beeswax candle burning upon the work table. The shadows in the corners of the room stretch out, lengthening into vast, impenetrable pools of absolute black. The stone walls feel closer, the ceiling heavier. The silence of the room, previously masked by the crackle of the flames, now rushes in to fill the void, an absolute, ringing quiet that presses heavily against the eardrums. Only two small tasks remain. The physician walks to the far, shadowed corner where the water clock stands. They must ensure its endless, dripping rhythm continues unbroken until the morning light. They lift the large terracotta pitcher, which still holds a generous amount of pure well water. They hold it over the wide upper basin of the polished brass clock. They pour. The water falls with a heavy, resonant, splashing sound that echoes loudly in the newly darkened room. Splash, gurgle, slosh. The upper cylinder fills to the very brim. The tiny, microscopic aperture at the bottom will continue to feed the slow, agonizing passage of time. The drops resume their solitary, watery cadence. Plink, plink, plink. The physician walks back to the work table. The single beeswax candle casts a small, intensely warm, circular halo of golden light upon the dark oak wood. Beside the candle holder sits a small, delicate brass snuffer, a tiny, hollow cone attached to a long, slender handle. The physician picks up the snuffer. The metal is completely cold. They hold the tiny brass cone directly over the brilliant, motionless golden teardrop of the flame. With a slow, perfectly steady hand, they lower the cone. The brass descends, swallowing the light. As the rim of the cone touches the melted pool of wax at the base of the wick, the flame is instantly, silently starved of oxygen. There is no flicker, no sudden gust of wind. The light simply ceases to exist. The room is plunged into total, absolute blackness. A tiny, microscopic wisp of sweet, white smoke curls out from beneath the edge of the brass snuffer, carrying the heavy, comforting scent of burned honey and warm wax into the dark air. The physician sets the snuffer down. The sound of the brass touching the wood is the loudest thing in the world. Clink. They stand perfectly still in the dark, allowing their eyes to adjust to the heavy, oppressive absence of light. Slowly, the faint, dull, dark red glow of the banked embers bleeding through the gray ash becomes barely visible, casting a ghostly, blood-colored luminescence over the stones of the hearth. Guided only by memory and the faint red glow, The physician walks slowly across the dark floorboards toward the sleeping alcove. They reach the heavy, deep green velvet curtain that is tied back with the thick golden cord. Their fingers find the heavy knot. With a single, deliberate pull, the cord is released. Squeak, slip. The massive, heavy velvet curtain falls closed, sweeping across the stone floor with a long, continuous, incredibly soft swish. The curtain seals the entrance perfectly, blocking out even the faint red glow of the hearth. Inside the alcove, it is a sensory void. It is completely, absolutely dark. The air is intensely, overwhelmingly hot, thick with the heavy, powdery scent of crushed lavender and sweetgrass. The massive, feather-filled bed waits in the blackness, a perfectly constructed, deeply warm sanctuary at the absolute center of the freezing, endlessly silent winter world. The final step is merely to climb inside and let the endless monotony of the night entirely consume the mind. Inside the deep, cedar-lined sleeping alcove, the darkness is not merely an absence of light. It is a tangible, physical entity. It is a thick, impenetrable velvet blindfold that rests gently against the eyes, a flawless and absolute blackness that erases the boundaries of the physical world. The heavy, deep green velvet curtain, having been pulled shut with a soft, sweeping swish, has perfectly sealed the entrance, blocking out even the faintest, ghostly red luminescence of the banked embers on the distant hearth. The space within the alcove is tight, close, and intimately constrained, creating a perfect, localized microclimate entirely divorced from the freezing, chaotic void of the winter storm raging silently against the exterior of the ancient granite keep. The air within this sealed wooden pocket is profoundly, intensely hot. It is a heavy, baked, motionless heat, trapped between the thick cedar planks of the walls and the massive, feather-filled mattress. The lingering, concentrated heat from the brass bed warmer has thoroughly permeated the heavy layers of bedding, unlocking the dormant essential oils of the crushed lavender flowers and dried sweetgrass hidden deep within the canvas ticking. The resulting aroma is overwhelming in its comforting density. It is the concentrated, heavy scent of a warm, sun-baked summer field, a powdery, floral, deeply earthy perfume that immediately acts upon the nervous system, signaling to the tired muscles and the weary mind that the time for vigilance has entirely passed. The air is thick, almost syrupy with this fragrance, requiring slow, deep, deliberate breaths to fully draw it into the lungs. Beside the massive, elevated oak frame of the bed sits a small, incredibly sturdy mounting block, carved from a single, solid section of an ash tree trunk. The physician, standing in the absolute pitch blackness, reaches out with a pale, bare hand, their fingers brushing against the rough, woven texture of the unbleached linen sheet that drapes over the side of the mattress. Guided purely by touch and the ingrained muscle memory of countless identical nights, they lift their right foot, still encased in the thick, soft, hand-knitted sheep's wool stocking. They place it squarely upon the center of the wooden step. Creak. The dense ash wood compresses microscopically under the sudden transfer of weight, a low, structural groan that vibrates softly through the soles of the feet. With a slow, heavy, upward push, the physician steps onto the block, their left hand reaching out to grasp the thick, folded edge of the covers. The bedding is a massive, structural object in its own right, a veritable mountain of textiles designed to pin the sleeper down and entirely prevent the escape of body heat. The physician grips the heavy layers, the crisp linen sheet, the thick white wool blanket, the incredibly dense, matter-dyed crimson wool, and the crowning, massive weight of the stitched sheepskin pelts. With a coordinated physical heave, they pull the layers back. The sheer weight of the fabric resists briefly before folding over upon itself with a deep, heavy, muffled sound of shifting mass. Whump, rustle, shhhhh thump. A sudden, intense wave of trapped, superheated air billows outward from the opened bed, washing over the physician's face and chest. It is a dry, baking heat, completely devoid of the sharp wood smoke tang of the main room, smelling only of pure, clean linen, warm wool, and the intoxicating, heavy lavender. The physician turns, sitting slowly upon the edge of the high mattress. The heavy, unbleached canvas ticking yields instantly beneath them. The thousands of dried goose feathers packed within the sack shift and slide away from the point of pressure with a massive, continuous, dry rustling sound. Crinkle, crunch, swoosh. The sound is incredibly tactile, the acoustic manifestation of absolute softness yielding to heavy weight. With a slow, deliberate swing of the legs, the physician pulls their stockinged feet up and into the heated void of the bed. They slide their body downward, extending their legs fully toward the very foot of the massive oak frame, where the brass pan had baked the linens the longest. The heat against the feet is absolute, a profound, radiating warmth that instantly banishes any lingering memory of the cold stone floorboards. The physician lies back, allowing their full, heavy weight to settle perfectly into the very center of the mattress. The sinking process begins. It is an agonizingly slow, deeply luxurious descent into the down. The mattress is so thick, so overwhelmingly overstuffed, that it does not merely support the body, it consumes it. As the heavy torso presses downward, the displaced feathers rise up along the sides of the rib, the hips, and the outsides of the thighs, creating a perfect, custom-molded cradle of immense support. The spine aligns perfectly against the dense core of the mattress. The heavy muscles of the lower back, shoulders, and calves, which have spent the long, quiet hours of the day standing, sweeping, grinding, and pacing, instantly recognize that their endless sequence of mundane tasks is finally complete. They begin to slacken, releasing their microscopic tension, melting entirely into the baking heat of the canvas and down. The physician's left hand reaches out into the darkness, grasping the thick, folded edge of the heavy blankets. With a slow, pulling motion, they drag the immense weight of the bedding back over their body. The layers fall like a slow-motion avalanche of textile and leather. First, the warm, crisp, unbleached linen sheet settles perfectly over the chest and legs. Next, the heavy, white sheep's wool blanket drapes downward, adding its thick, insulating barrier. Then the incredibly dense, matter-dyed crimson blanket falls, its weight pressing the lower layers firmly against the skin. Finally, the massive structural bulk of the 3-stitched sheepskin pelts is pulled into place. Whump! The air is violently pushed out from beneath the blankets as they settle, sealing the edges of the bed tightly around the physician's neck, shoulders, and sides. The body is now perfectly, immovably pinned beneath the covers. It is a geological pressure, a deeply comforting heavy gravity that demands total, unresisting surrender. It is physically difficult to toss, to turn, or to shift the limbs beneath such an immense burden of fabric and hide. The only option is absolute, heavy stillness. The restriction of movement is not confining. It is a profound, protective embrace, a heavy, weighted armor against the vast, empty darkness of the night. The head falls back into the two massive, overstuffed pillows. They are filled with the identical mixture of soft down and dried herbs. As the heavy skull sinks into the center of the stacked pillows, the material rises up on either side, pressing gently against the ears and the sides of the face. This creates a secondary, localized layer of sensory deprivation. The remaining, ambient sounds of the keep, the faint, distant settling of the stone, the microscopic shifting of the oak beams, are entirely muffled, blocked by the dense wall of feathers and canvas. The world is instantly reduced to a radius of a few inches, defined solely by the internal biology of the physician. In the absolute silence, the sound of their own slow, heavy breathing becomes the loudest, most dominant noise in existence. The air enters the nostrils with a soft, rushing whisper. Inhale. SSSSHHH. The chest, burdened by the immense weight of the pelts, rises slowly, requiring a deliberate, comforting physical effort to expand the lungs. The air is held for a long, quiet moment, mixing with the internal heat of the body before being slowly, methodically released. Exhale. Ha. The chest falls back down, the heavy blankets settling even closer against the skin. The rhythm is perfectly monotonous, a slow biological metronome of deep, heavy respiration. Inhale. SSSSHHH. Exhale. Ha. Beneath the sound of the breath lies the deep, slow, rhythmic thumping of the heart. It is a heavy, muffled drumbeat echoing through the relaxed chest cavity. Thump-thud, thump-thud. As the heat of the bed seeps perfectly into the marrow of the bones, warming the blood and soothing the nervous system, the heartbeat begins to slow. It stretches out, the space between the beats lengthening, matching the profoundly slow, utterly relaxed state of the heavy limbs. In the warm, completely dark void, the mind begins its final, slow descent into the deep waters of unconsciousness. It does not race. It does not worry. There is absolutely nothing to worry about. The mind gently reviews the perfect, unbroken state of the keep, finding absolute, impenetrable security in every mundane detail. The heavy oak door is bolted with a massive iron bar, thick enough to withstand a siege. The 3-foot-thick solid granite walls are entirely impervious to the howling, frozen winds of the endless winter storm outside. The fire is perfectly banked, trapped beneath a suffocating mountain of pale gray ash. The massive oak logs safely, invisibly smoldering, guaranteeing the room will remain intensely warm until the morning light. The mind drifts to the heavy oak work table. The tools of the trade are flawless, polished to a brilliant, unblemished mirror finish, sealed safely within the velvet-lined rosewood casket, the heavy iron lock engaged, the brass key resting deeply in the pocket of the hung robe. The heavy ox-hide boots are perfectly clean, heavily oiled, and softening gently upon the warm stones of the hearth. The medicinal honey pastilles are perfectly hardened, secure within their woven birch box. The clean linen bandages are tightly, perfectly rolled. The heavy leather ledger is written, the ink dried by the river sand, the heavy brass clasp firmly fastened. There is not a single crumb of ash out of place. There is not a single draft of cold air piercing the room. The isolation is total. The safety is absolute. There is nothing left to do. There is nowhere left to be. There is only the dark, the heat, and the heavy, unending silence. Even the distant, muffled ticking of the brass water clock in the far corner of the chamber seems to alter its nature as it filters through the heavy velvet curtain and the dense down pillows. It is no longer a sharp, metallic plink, but a deep, resonant, heavy, watery pulse. Thrum, thrum, thrum. It synchronizes perfectly with the slow, heavy beating of the physician's heart, weaving itself into the biological rhythm of the sleeping body. The conscious awareness of the physical self begins to fray at the very edges. The specific sensation of the toes, perfectly warm within the thick wool stockings, slowly fades away. The feeling of the heavy, relaxed fingers, resting motionless against the rough linen sheet at the chest, dissolves into a general, soft numbness. The boundaries between the heavy limbs and the baking heat of the mattress become entirely blurred. The physician is no longer a physical person lying within a bed. They have become a localized locus of intense warmth, a floating point of heavy, peaceful consciousness suspended within a vast, infinite, perfectly dark, and utterly silent universe. The breathing becomes incredibly shallow, incredibly soft, a microscopic exchange of warm, lavender-scented air. The heavy, weighted eyelids, already closed against the pitch blackness, seem to press down with an incredibly comforting, leaden weight. The mind completely ceases to form distinct words, images, or thoughts. The endless, mundane, beautiful monotony of the day's chores has scrubbed the brain entirely clean of anxiety, leaving behind only a smooth, featureless landscape of pure, unadulterated boredom. It is a boredom so profound, so deeply safe, that it transforms into the ultimate heavy luxury. The final conscious thought is merely a slow, fading observation of the intense, enveloping warmth. The heavy sheepskins press down, the feathers rise up, the heat bakes through the linen, the silence rings softly in the ears. The water clock drips its slow, watery tear into the dark room beyond the curtain. Thrum. The last remaining tension in the jaw completely releases. The body surrenders entirely to the immense, crushing gravity of the bed. The darkness thickens, swallowing the last fragments of awareness, pulling the mind down into a deep, heavy, perfectly undisturbed and endlessly peaceful ocean of dreamless, winter slumber. The end.